This is Chapter 40 of Sketches New and Old. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Sketches New and Old by Mark Twain, Chapter 40, A Ghost Story. I took a large room, far up Broadway, in a huge old building whose upper stories had been wholly unoccupied for years until I came. The place had long been given up to dust and cobwebs, to solitude and silence. I seemed groping among the tombs and invading the privacy of the dead that first night I climbed up to my quarters. For the first time in my life a superstitious dread came over me, and as I turned a dark angle of the stairway, and an invisible cobweb swung its slazy woof in my face and clung there, I shuddered as one who had encountered a phantom. I was glad enough when I reached my room and locked out the mold and the darkness. A cheery fire was burning in the grate, and I sat down before it with a comforting sense of relief. For 2 hours I sat there, thinking of bygone times, recalling old scenes and summoning half-forgotten faces out of the mists of the past, listening in fancy to voices that long ago grew silent for all time, and to once familiar songs that nobody sings now. And as my reverie softened down to a sadder and sadder pathos, the shrieking of the winds outside softened to a wail, the angry beating of the rain against the panes diminished to a tranquil patter, and one by one the noises in the street subsided until the hurrying footsteps of the last belated straggler died away in the distance and left no sound behind. The fire had burned low. A sense of loneliness crept over me. I arose and undressed, moving on tiptoe about the room, doing stealthily what I had to do, as if I were environed by sleeping enemies whose slumbers it would be fatal to break. I covered up in bed, and lay listening to the rain and wind and the faint creaking of distant shutters, till they lulled me to sleep. I slept profoundly, but how long I do not know. All at once I found myself awake, and filled with a shuddering expectancy. All was still. All but my own heart. I could hear it beat. Presently the bedclothes began to slip away slowly toward the foot of the bed, as if some one were pulling them. I could not stir. I could not speak. Still the blankets slipped deliberately away, till my breast was uncovered. Then, with a great effort, I seized them and drew them over my head. I waited, listened, waited. Once more that steady pull began, and once more I lay torpid a century of dragging seconds till my breast was naked again. At last I roused my energies and snatched the covers back to their place and held them with a strong grip. I waited. By and by I felt a faint tug, and took a fresh grip. The tug strengthened to a steady strain. It grew stronger and stronger. My hold parted, and for the third time the blanket slid away. I groaned. An answering groan came from the foot of the bed. Beaded drops of sweat stood upon my forehead. I was more dead than alive. Presently I heard a heavy footstep in my room. The step of an elephant, it seemed to me. It was not like anything human. But it was moving from me. There was relief in that. I heard it approach the door, pass out without moving bolt or lock, and wander away among the dismal corridors, straining the floors and joists till they creaked again as it passed, and then silence reigned once more. When my excitement had calmed, I said to myself, "This is a dream, simply a hideous dream." And so I lay thinking it over until I convinced myself that it was a dream, and then a comforting laugh relaxed my lips, and I was happy again. I got up and struck a light, and when I found that the locks and bolts were just as I had left them, another soothing laugh welled in my heart and rippled from my lips. I took my pipe and lit it, and was just sitting down before the fire when down went the pipe out of my nerveless fingers, the blood forsook my cheeks, and my placid breathing was cut short with a gasp. In the ashes on the hearth, side by side with my own bare footprint, was another, so vast that in comparison mine was but an infant's. Then I had had a visitor, and the elephant tread was explained. I put out the light and returned to bed, palsied with fear. I lay a long time, peering into the darkness and listening. Then I heard a grating noise overhead, like the dragging of a heavy body across the floor, then the throwing down of the body, and the shaking of my windows in response to the concussion. In distant parts of the building I heard the muffled slamming of doors. I heard, at intervals, stealthy footsteps creeping in and out among the corridors and up and down the stairs. Sometimes these noises approached my door, hesitated, and went away again. I heard the clanking of chains faintly in remote passages, and listened while the clanking grew nearer, while it wearily climbed the stairways, marking each move by the loose surplus of chain that fell with an accented rattle upon each succeeding step, as the goblin that bore it advanced. I heard muttered sentences, half-uttered screams that seemed smothered violently, and the swish of invisible garments, the rush of invisible wings. Then I became conscious that my chamber was invaded, that I was not alone. I heard sighs and breathings about my bed, and mysterious whisperings. 3 little spheres of soft phosphorescent light appeared on the ceiling directly over my head, clung and glowed there a moment, and then dropped, 2 of them upon my face and 1 upon the pillow. They spattered liquidly and felt warm. Intuition told me they had turned to gouts of blood as they fell. I needed no light to satisfy myself of that. Then I saw pallid faces, dimly luminous, and white uplifted hands, floating bodiless in the air, floating a moment and then disappearing. The whispering ceased, and the voices and the sounds, and a solemn stillness followed. I waited and listened. I felt that I must have light or die. I was weak with fear. I slowly raised myself toward a sitting posture, and my face came in contact with a clammy hand. All strength went from me apparently, and I fell back like a stricken invalid. Then I heard the rustle of a garment. It seemed to pass to the door and go out. When everything was still once more, I crept out of bed, sick and feeble, and lit the gas with a hand that trembled as if it were aged with 100 years. The light brought some little cheer to my spirits. I sat down and fell into a dreamy contemplation of that great footprint in the ashes. By and by its outlines began to waver and grow dim. I glanced up, and the broad gas flame was slowly wilting away. In the same moment I heard that elephantine tread again. I noted its approach, nearer and nearer, along the musty halls, and dimmer the light waned. The tread reached my very door and paused. The light had dwindled to a sickly blue, and all things about me lay in a spectral twilight. The door did not open, and yet I felt a faint gust of air fan my cheek, and presently was conscious of a huge, cloudy presence before me. I watched it with fascinated eyes. A pale glow stole over the thing. Gradually its cloudy folds took shape. An arm appeared, then legs, then a body, and last a great sad face looked out of the vapor. Stripped of its filmy housings, naked, muscular and comely, the majestic Cardiff giant loomed above me. All my misery vanished, for a child might know that no harm could come with that benignant countenance. My cheerful spirits returned at once, and in sympathy with them the gas flamed up brightly again. Never a lonely outcast was so glad to welcome company as I was to greet the friendly giant. I said, "Why, is it nobody but you? Do you know, I have been scared to death for the last 2 or 3 hours. I am most honestly glad to see you. I wish I had a chair. Here, don't try to sit down in that thing." But it was too late. He was in it before I could stop him, and down he went. I never saw a chair shivered so in my life. "Stop, you'll ruin Too late again. There was another crash, and another chair was resolved into its original elements. "Confound it, haven't you got any judgment at all? Do you want to ruin all the furniture on the place? Here, you petrified fool!" But it was no use. Before I could arrest him he had sat down on the bed, and it was a melancholy ruin. Now what sort of a way is that to do? First you come lumbering about the place bringing a legion of vagabond goblins along with you to worry me to death, and then when I overlook an indelicacy of costume which would not be tolerated anywhere by cultivated people except in a respectable theater, and not even there if the nudity were of your sex, you repay me by wrecking all the furniture you can find to sit down on. And why will you? You damage yourself as much as you do me. You have broken off the end of your spinal column, and littered up the floor with chips of your hams till the place looks like a marble yard. You ought to be ashamed of yourself. You are big enough to know better.
Well, I will not break any more furniture, but what am I to do? I have not had a chance to sit down for a century.
And the tears came into his eyes. Poor devil, I said. I should not have been so harsh with you. And you are an orphan, too, no doubt. But sit down on the floor here. Nothing else can stand your weight. And besides, we cannot be sociable with you away up there above me. I want you down where I can perch on this high counting-house stool and gossip with you face to face. So he sat down on the floor and lit a pipe which I gave him, threw one of my red blankets over his shoulders, inverted my sitz-bath on his head, helmet fashion, and made himself picturesque and comfortable. Then he crossed his ankles while I renewed the fire, and exposed the flat honeycombed bottoms of his prodigious feet to the grateful warmth. What is the matter with the bottom of your feet and the back of your legs, that they are gouged up so?
Infernal chilblains. I caught them clear up to the back of my head, roosting out there under Newell's farm. But I love the place. I love it as one loves his old home. There is no peace for me like the peace I feel when I am there.
We talked along for half an hour, and then I noticed that he looked tired, and spoke of it.
Tired? He said. Well, I should think so. And now I will tell you all about it, since you have treated me so well. I am the spirit of the petrified man that lies across the street there in the museum. I am the ghost of the Cardiff giant. I can have no rest, no peace, till they have given that poor body burial again. Now, what was the most natural thing for me to do, to make men satisfy this wish? Terrify them into it, haunt the place where the body lay. So I haunted the museum night after night. I even got other spirits to help me, but it did no good, for nobody ever came to the museum at midnight. Then it occurred to me to come over the way and haunt this place a little. I felt that if I ever got a hearing I must succeed, for I had the most efficient company that perdition could furnish. Night after night we have shivered around through these mildewed halls, dragging chains, groaning, whispering, tramping up and down stairs, till, to tell you the truth, I am almost worn out. But when I saw a light in your room tonight, I roused my energies again and went at it with a deal of the old freshness. But I am tired out, entirely fagged out. Give me, I beseech you, give me some hope. I lit off my perch in a burst of excitement, and exclaimed, "This transcends everything, everything that ever did occur. Why, you poor blundering old fossil, you have had all your trouble for nothing. You have been haunting a plaster cast of yourself. The real Cardiff giant is in Albany." A fact. The original fraud was ingeniously and fraudulently duplicated and exhibited in New York as the only genuine Cardiff giant, to the unspeakable disgust of the owners of the real Colossus, at the very same time that the latter was drawing crowds at a museum in Albany. Confound it, don't you know your own remains? I never saw such an eloquent look of shame, of pitiable humiliation, overspread a countenance before. The petrified man rose slowly to his feet and said, "Honestly, is that true?" "As true as I am sitting here." He took the pipe from his mouth and laid it on the mantel, then stood irresolute a moment, unconsciously, from old habit,
thrusting his hands where his pantaloons pockets should have been, and meditatively dropping his chin on his breast, and finally said, "Well, I never felt so absurd before. The Petrified man has sold everybody else, and now the mean fraud has ended by selling its own ghost. My son, if there is any charity left in your heart for a poor friendless phantom like me, don't let this get out. Think how you would feel if you had made such an ass of yourself." I heard his stately tramp die away, step by step down the stairs and out into the deserted street, and felt sorry that he was gone, poor fellow, and sorrier still that he had carried off my red blanket and my bathtub. End of chapter 40. This is chapter 41 of Sketches New and Old. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Sketches New and Old by Mark Twain. Chapter 41, The Capitoline Venus. Chapter 1, Scene, An Artist's Studio in Rome. "Oh, George, I do love you." "Bless your dear heart, Mary, I know that. Why is your father so obdurate?" "George, he means well, but art is folly to him. He only understands groceries. He thinks you would starve me." "Confound his wisdom, it savors of inspiration. Why am I not a money-making bowelless grocer instead of a divinely gifted sculptor with nothing to eat?" "Do not despond, Georgie dear. All his prejudices will fade away as soon as you shall have acquired $50,000. "50,000 demons! Child, I am in arrears for my board." Chapter 2, Scene, A Dwelling in Rome. "My dear sir, it is useless to talk. I haven't anything against you, but I can't let my daughter marry a hash of love, art, and starvation. I believe you have nothing else to offer." "Sir, I am poor, I grant you. But is fame nothing? The Honorable Bellamy Foodle, of Arkansas, says that my new statue of America is a clever piece of sculpture, and he is satisfied that my name will one day be famous." "Bosh! What does that Arkansas ass know about it? Fame's nothing. The market price of your marble scarecrow is the thing to look at. It took you 6 months to chisel it, and you can't sell it for $100. No, sir. Show me $50,000 and you can have my daughter. Otherwise she marries young Simper. You have just 6 months to raise the money and— Good morning, sir." "Alas, woe is me." Chapter 3, Scene, The Studio. "Oh, John, friend of my boyhood, I am the unhappiest of men."
"You're a simpleton."
"I have nothing left to love but my poor statue of America, and see, even she has no sympathy for me in her cold marble countenance, so beautiful and so heartless."
"You're a dummy."
"Oh, John, oh, fudge."
"Didn't you say you had 6 months to raise the money in?"
"Don't deride my agony, John. If I had 6 centuries, what good would it do? How could it help a poor wretch without name, capital, or friends?"
"Idiot! Coward! Baby! 6 months to raise the money in, and 5 will do."
"Are you insane?"
6 months! An abundance! Leave it to me, I'll raise it."
"What do you mean, John? How on earth can you raise such a monstrous sum for me?"
"Will you let that be my business and not meddle? Will you leave the thing in my hands? Will you swear to submit to whatever I do? Will you pledge me to find no fault with my actions?"
"I am dizzy, bewildered, but I swear." John took a hammer and deliberately smashed the nose of America. He made another pass, and 2 of her fingers fell to the floor. Another, and part of an ear came away. Another, and a row of toes was mangled and dismembered. Another, and the left leg, from the knee down, lay a fragmentary ruin. John put on his hat and departed. George gazed speechless upon the battered and grotesque nightmare before him for the space of 30 seconds, and then wilted to the floor and went into convulsions. John returned presently with a carriage, got the broken-hearted artist and the broken-legged statue aboard, and drove off, whistling low and tranquilly. He left the artist at his lodgings, and drove off and disappeared down the Via Quirinalis with the statue. Chapter 4. Scene, the studio.
The 6 months will be up at 2 o'clock today. Oh, agony! My life is blighted. I would that I were dead. I had no supper yesterday. I have had no breakfast today. I dare not enter an eating-house. And hungry? Don't mention it. My bootmaker duns me to death. My tailor duns me. My landlord haunts me. I am miserable. I haven't seen John since that awful day. She smiles on me tenderly when we meet in the great thoroughfares, but her old flint of a father makes her look in the other direction in short order. Now who is knocking at that door? Who is come to persecute me? That malignant villain, the bootmaker, I'll warrant. Come in. Ah, happiness attend your highness. Heaven be propitious to your grace. I have brought my lord's new boots. Ah, say nothing about the pay. There is no hurry, none in the world. Shall be proud if my noble lord will continue to honor me with his custom. Ah, adieu. Brought the boots himself? Don't want his pay? Takes his leave with a bow and a scrape fit to honor majesty withal. Desires a continuance of my custom. Is the world coming to an end? Of all the— Come in. Pardon, signor, but I have brought your new suit of clothes for— Come in. 1,000 pardons for this intrusion, your worship, but I have prepared the beautiful suite of rooms below for you. This wretched den is but ill-suited to— Come in. I have called to say that your credit at our bank, some time since unfortunately interrupted, is entirely and most satisfactorily restored, and we shall be most happy if you will draw upon us for any— Come in. My noble boy, she is yours. She'll be here in a moment. Take her, marry her, love her, be happy. God bless you both. Hip, hip, hur— Come in! Oh, George, my own darling, we are saved. Oh, Mary, my own darling, we are saved, but I'll swear I don't know why nor how. Chapter 5. Scene, a Roman cafe. One of a group of American gentlemen reads and translates from the weekly edition of Il Sanguange di Roma as follows. Wonderful discovery. Some 6 months ago, Signor John Smith, an American gentleman now some years a resident of Rome, purchased for a trifle a small piece of ground in the Campagna, just beyond the tomb of the Scipio family, from the owner, a bankrupt relative of the Princess Borghese. Mr. Smith afterward went to the Minister of the Public Records and had the piece of ground transferred to a poor American artist named George Arnold, explaining that he did it as payment and satisfaction for pecuniary damage accidentally done by him long since upon property belonging to Signor Arnold, and further observed that he would make additional satisfaction by improving the ground for Signor A. at his own charge and cost. 4 weeks ago, while making some necessary excavations upon the property, Signor Smith unearthed the most remarkable ancient statue that has ever been added to the opulent art treasures of Rome. It was an exquisite figure of a woman, and though sadly stained by the soil and the mold of ages, no eye can look unmoved upon its ravishing beauty. The nose, the left leg from the knee down, an ear, and also the toes of the right foot and 2 fingers of one of the hands were gone, but otherwise the noble figure was in a remarkable state of preservation. The government at once took military possession of the statue, and appointed a commission of art critics, antiquaries, and cardinal princes of the church to assess its value and determine the remuneration that must go to the owner of the ground in which it was found. The whole affair was kept a profound secret until last night. In the meantime the commission sat with closed doors and deliberated. Last night they decided unanimously that the statue is a Venus, and the work of some unknown but sublimely gifted artist of the 3rd century before Christ. They consider it the most faultless work of art the world has any knowledge of. At midnight they held a final conference, and decided that the Venus was worth the enormous sum of 10,000,000 francs.
In accordance with Roman law and Roman usage, the government being half owner in all works of art found in the Campagna, the state has naught to do but pay 5,000,000 francs to Mr. Arnold and take permanent possession of the beautiful statue. This morning the Venus will be removed to the Capitol, there to remain, and at noon the commission will wait upon Signor Arnold with His Holiness the Pope's order upon the treasury for the princely sum of 5,000,000 francs in gold. Chorus of voices: "Luck! It's no name for it." Another voice: "Gentlemen, I propose that we immediately form an American Joint Stock Company for the purchase of lands and excavations of statues here, with proper connections in Wall Street to bull and bear the stock." All: "Agreed." Chapter 6. Scene: the Roman Capitol 10 years later. Dearest Mary, this is the most celebrated statue in the world. This is the renowned Capitoline Venus you've heard so much about. Here she is with her little blemishes restored, that is, patched, by the most noted Roman artists, and the mere fact that they did the humble patching of so noble a creation will make their names illustrious while the world stands. How strange it seems, this place! The day before I last stood here, 10 happy years ago, I wasn't a rich man, bless your soul, I hadn't a cent, and yet I had a good deal to do with making Rome mistress of this grandest work of ancient art the world contains. The worshipped, the illustrious Capitoline Venus, and what a sum she is valued at, 10 millions of francs. Yes, now she is. And oh, Georgie, how divinely beautiful she is. Ah, yes, but nothing to what she was before that blessed John Smith broke her leg and battered her nose. Ingenious Smith, gifted Smith, noble Smith, author of all our bliss. Hark, do you know what that wheeze means? Mary, that cub has got the whooping cough. Will you never learn to take care of the children? The End. The Capitoline Venus is still in the Capitol at Rome, and is still the most charming and most illustrious work of ancient art the world can boast of. But if ever it shall be your fortune to stand before it and go into the customary ecstasies over it, don't permit this true and secret history of its origin to mar your bliss, and when you read about a gigantic petrified man being dug up near Syracuse, in the State of New York, or near any other place, keep your own counsel, and if the Barnum that buried him there offers to sell to you at an enormous sum, don't you buy. Send him to the Pope. Note: the above sketch was written at the time the famous swindle of the petrified giant was the sensation of the day in the United States. End of chapter 41. This is chapter 42 of Sketches New and Old. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Sketches New and Old by Mark Twain, chapter 42, Speech on Accident Insurance, delivered in Hartford at a dinner to Cornelius Walford of London. Gentlemen, I am glad indeed to assist in welcoming the distinguished guest of this occasion to a city whose fame as an insurance center has extended to all lands, and given us the name of being a quadruple band of brothers working sweetly hand in hand, the Colt's Arms Company making the destruction of our race easy and convenient, our life insurance citizens paying for the victims when they pass away, Mr. Batterson perpetuating their memory with his stately monuments, and our fire insurance comrades taking care of their hereafter. I am glad to assist in welcoming our guest, first because he is an Englishman, and I owe a heavy debt of hospitality to certain of his fellow countrymen, and secondly, because he is in sympathy with insurance, and has been the means of making many other men cast their sympathies in the same direction. Certainly there is no nobler field for human effort than the insurance line of business, especially accident insurance. Ever since I have been a director in an accident insurance company, I have felt that I am a better man. Life has seemed more precious. Accidents have assumed a kindlier aspect. distressing special providences have lost half their horror. I look upon a cripple now with affectionate interest, as an advertisement. I do not seem to care for poetry any more. I do not care for politics. Even agriculture does not excite me. But to me now there is a charm about a railway collision that is unspeakable. There is nothing more beneficent than accident insurance. I have seen an entire family lifted out of poverty and into affluence by the simple boon of a broken leg. I have had people come to me on crutches, with tears in their eyes, to bless this beneficent institution. In all my experience of life, I have seen nothing so seraphic as the look that comes into a freshly mutilated man's face when he feels in his vest pocket with his remaining hand and finds his accident ticket all right. And I have seen nothing so sad as the look that came into another splintered customer's face when he found he couldn't collect on a wooden leg. I will remark here, by way of advertisement, that noble charity which we have named the Hartford Accident Insurance Company (the speaker is a director of the company named) is an institution which is peculiarly to be depended upon. A man is bound to prosper who gives it his custom. No man can take out a policy in it and not get crippled before the year is out. Now there was one indigent man who had been disappointed so often with other companies that he had grown disheartened. His appetite left him, he ceased to smile, life was but a weariness. 3 weeks ago I got him to insure with us, and now he is the brightest, happiest spirit in this land, has a good steady income and a stylish suit of new bandages every day, and travels around on a shutter. I will say in conclusion that my share of the welcome to our guest is none the less hearty because I talk so much nonsense, and I know that I can say the same for the rest of the speakers. End of chapter 42. This is chapter 43 of Sketches New and Old. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Sketches New and Old by Mark Twain, chapter 43, John Chinaman in New York. As I passed along by one of those monster American tea stores in New York, I found a Chinaman sitting before it, acting in the capacity of a sign. Everybody that passed by gave him a steady stare as long as their heads would twist over their shoulders without dislocating their necks, and a group had stopped to stare deliberately. Is it not a shame that we, who prate so much about civilization and humanity, are content to degrade a fellow being to such an office as this? Is it not time for reflection when we find ourselves willing to see in such a being matter for frivolous curiosity instead of regret and grave reflection? Here was a poor creature whom hard fortune had exiled from his natural home beyond the seas, and whose troubles ought to have touched these idle strangers that thronged about him. But did it? Apparently not. Men calling themselves the superior race, the race of culture and of gentle blood, scanned his quaint Chinese hat, with peaked roof and ball on top, and his long queue dangling down his back, his short silken blouse, curiously frogged and figured, and like the rest of his raiment rusty, dilapidated, and awkwardly put on, his blue cotton tight-legged pants tied close around the ankles, and his clumsy blunt-toed shoes with thick cork soles, and having so scanned him from head to foot, cracked some unseemly joke about his outlandish attire or his melancholy face, and passed on. In my heart I pitied the friendless Mongol. I wondered what was passing behind his sad face, and what distant scene his vacant eye was dreaming of. Were his thoughts with his heart 10,000 miles away, beyond the billowy wastes of the Pacific, among the rice fields and the plumy palms of China, under the shadows of remembered mountain peaks, or in groves of bloomy shrubs and strange forest trees unknown to climes like ours? And now and then, rippling among his visions and his dreams, did he hear familiar laughter and half-forgotten voices, and did he catch fitful glimpses of the friendly faces of a bygone time? A cruel fate it is, I said, that is befallen this bronzed wanderer. In order that the group of idlers might be touched, at least by the words of the poor fellow, since the appeal of his pauper dress and his dreary exile was lost upon them, I touched him on the shoulder and said, "Cheer up! Don't be downhearted. It is not America that treats you in this way, it is merely one citizen whose greed of gain has eaten the humanity out of his heart. America has a broader hospitality for the exiled and oppressed. America and Americans are always ready to help the unfortunate. Money shall be raised. You shall go back to China. You shall see your friends again. What wages do they pay you here?"
"Divil a cent but $4 a week and find meself, but it's aisy bearing the troublesome fur and clothes that's so expensive."
The exile remains at his post. The New York tea merchants who need picturesque signs are not likely to run out of Chinamen. End of chapter 43. This is chapter 44 of Sketches New and Old. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Sketches New and Old by Mark Twain, chapter 44, How I Edited an Agricultural Paper, written about 1870. I did not take temporary editorship of an agricultural paper without misgivings. Neither would a landsman take command of a ship without misgivings. But I was in circumstances that made the salary an object. The regular editor of the paper was going off for a holiday, and I accepted the terms he offered, and took his place. The sensation of being at work again was luxurious, and I wrought all the week with unflagging pleasure. We went to press, and I waited a day with some solicitude to see whether my effort was going to attract any notice. As I left the office, toward sundown, a group of men and boys at the foot of the stairs dispersed with one impulse and gave me passageway, and I heard one or two of them say, "That's him." I was naturally pleased by this incident. The next morning I found a similar group at the foot of the stairs, and scattering couples and individuals standing here and there in the street and over the way, watching me with interest. The group separated and fell back as I approached, and I heard a man say, "Look at his eye." I pretended not to observe the notice I was attracting, but secretly I was pleased with it, and was proposing to write an account of it to my aunt. I went up the short flight of stairs and heard cheery voices and a ringing laugh as I drew near the door, which I opened, and caught a glimpse of two young rural-looking men, whose faces blanched and lengthened when they saw me, and then they both plunged through the window with a great crash. I was surprised. In about half an hour an old gentleman, with a flowing beard and a fine but rather austere face, entered, and sat down at my invitation. He seemed to have something on his mind. He took off his hat and set it on the floor, and got out of it a red silk handkerchief and a copy of our paper. He put the paper on his lap, and while he polished his spectacles with his handkerchief, he said, "Are you the new editor?" I said I was. "Have you ever edited an agricultural paper before?" "No," I said. "This is my first attempt." "Very likely. Have you had any experience in agriculture practically?" "No, I believe I have not." "Some instinct told me so," said the old gentleman, putting on his spectacles, and looking over them at me with asperity, while he folded his paper into a convenient shape. "I wish to read you what must have made me have that instinct. It was this editorial. Listen, and see if it was you that wrote it. 'Turnips should never be pulled. It injures them. It is much better to send a boy up and let him shake the tree.' Now, what do you think of that? For I really suppose you wrote it." "Think of it? Why, I think it is good. I think it is sense. I have no doubt that every year millions and millions of bushels of turnips are spoiled, in this township alone, by being pulled in a half-ripe condition, when if they had sent a boy up to shake the tree—" "Shake your grandmother! Turnips don't grow on trees." "Oh, they don't they? Well, who said they did? The language was intended to be figurative, wholly figurative. Anybody that knows anything will know that I meant that the boy should shake the vine." Then this old person got up and tore his paper all into small shreds, and stamped on them, and broke several things with his cane, and said I did not know as much as a cow, and then went out and banged the door after him, and, in short, acted in such a way that I fancied he was displeased about something. But not knowing what the trouble was, I could not be any help to him. Pretty soon after this a long cadaverous creature, with lanky locks hanging down to his shoulders, and a week's stubble bristling from the hills and valleys of his face, darted within the door, and halted, motionless, with finger on lip, and head and body bent in listening attitude. No sound was heard. Still he listened. No sound. Then he turned the key in the door, and came elaborately tiptoeing toward me till he was within long-reaching distance of me, when he stopped, and, after scanning my face with intense interest for a while, drew a folded copy of our paper from his bosom, and said, "There, you wrote that. Read it to me, quick. Relieve me. I suffer." I read as follows, and as the sentences fell from my lips I could see the relief come. I could see the drawn muscles relax, and the anxiety go out of the face, and rest and peace steal over the features like the merciful moonlight over a desolate landscape. "The guano is a fine bird, but great care is necessary in rearing it. It should not be imported earlier than June or later than September. In the winter it should be kept in a warm place, where it can hatch out its young. It is evident that we are to have a backward season for grain, therefore it will be well for the farmer to begin setting out his cornstalks and planting his buckwheat cakes in July instead of August. Concerning the pumpkin, this berry is a favorite with the natives of the interior of New England, who prefer it to the gooseberry for the making of fruit cake, and who likewise give it the preference over the raspberry for feeding cows, as being more filling and fully as satisfying. The pumpkin is the only esculent of the orange family that will thrive in the North, except the gourd and one or two varieties of the squash. But the custom of planting it in the front yard with the shrubbery is fast going out of vogue, for it is now generally conceded that the pumpkin as a shade tree is a failure. Now, as the warm weather approaches, and the ganders begin to spawn—" The excited listener sprang toward me to shake hands, and said, "There, that will do. I know I am all right now, because you have read it just as I did, word for word. But, stranger, when I first read it this morning I said to myself I never believed it before, notwithstanding my friends kept me under watch so strict, but now I believe I am crazy. And with that I fetched a howl that you might have heard 2 miles, and started out to kill somebody, because, you know, I knew it would come to that sooner or later, and so I might as well begin. I read one of them paragraphs over again so as to be certain, and then I burned my house down and started. I have crippled several people, and have got one fellow up a tree, where I can get him if I want him. But I thought I would call in here as I passed along and make the thing perfectly certain. And now it is certain, and I tell you it is lucky for the chap that is in the tree. I should have killed him sure, as I went back. Good-bye, sir, good-bye. You have taken a great load off my mind. My reason has stood the strain of one of your agricultural articles, and I know that nothing can ever unseat it now. Good-bye, sir." I felt a little uncomfortable about the cripplings and arsons this person had been entertaining himself with, for I could not help feeling remotely accessory to them. But these thoughts were quickly banished, for the regular editor walked in. I thought to myself, now, if you had gone to Egypt as I recommended you to, I might have had a chance to get my hand in, but you wouldn't do it, and here you are. I sort of expected you. The editor was looking sad and perplexed and dejected. He surveyed the wreck which that old rioter and those 2 young farmers had made, and then said, "This is a sad business, a very sad business. There is the mucilage bottle broken, and 6 panes of glass, and a spittoon, and 2 candlesticks. But that is not the worst. The reputation of the paper is injured, and permanently, I fear. True, there never was such a call for the paper before, and it never sold such a large edition or soared to such celebrity,
But does one want to be famous for lunacy, and prosper upon the infirmities of his mind? My friend, as I am an honest man, the street out here is full of people, and others are roosting on the fences, waiting to get a glimpse of you because they think you are crazy. And well, they might, after reading your editorials. They are a disgrace to journalism. Why, what put it into your head that you could edit a paper of this nature? You do not seem to know the first rudiments of agriculture. You speak of a furrow and a harrow as being the same thing. You talk of the molting season for cows, and you recommend the domestication of the polecat on account of its playfulness and its excellence as a ratter. Your remark that clams will lie quiet if music be played to them was superfluous, entirely superfluous. Nothing disturbs clams. Clams always lie quiet. Clams care nothing whatever about music. Ah, heavens and earth, friend, if you had made the acquiring of ignorance the study of your life, you could not have graduated with higher honor than you could today. I never saw anything like it. Your observation that the horse-chestnut as an article of commerce is steadily gaining in favor is simply calculated to destroy this journal. I want you to throw up your situation and go. I want no more holiday. I could not enjoy it if I had it. Certainly not with you in my chair. I would always stand in dread of what you might be going to recommend next. It makes me lose all patience every time I think of your discussing oyster beds under the head of landscape gardening. I want you to go. Nothing on earth could persuade me to take another holiday. Oh, why didn't you tell me you didn't know anything about agriculture? Tell you? You cornstalk, you cabbage, you son of a cauliflower? It's the first time I ever heard such an unfeeling remark. I tell you, I have been in the editorial business going on 14 years, and it is the first time I ever heard of a man's having to know anything in order to edit a newspaper. You turnip! Who write the dramatic critiques for the second-rate papers? Why, a parcel of promoted shoemakers and apprentice apothecaries, who know just as much about good acting as I do about good farming, and no more. Who review the books? People who never wrote one. Who do up the heavy leaders on finance? Parties who have had the largest opportunities for knowing nothing about it. Who criticize the Indian campaigns? Gentlemen who do not know a war-whoop from a wigwam, and who never have had to run a foot-race with a tomahawk, or pluck arrows out of the several members of their families to build the evening campfire with. Who write the temperance appeals, and clamor about the flowing bowl? Folks who will never draw another sober breath till they do it in the grave. Who edit the agricultural papers? You. Yam? Men as a general thing who fail in the poetry line, yellow-colored novel line, sensation, drama line, city editor line, and finally fall back on agriculture as a temporary reprieve from the poorhouse. You try to tell me anything about the newspaper business. Sir, I have been through it from Alpha to Omaha, and I tell you that the less a man knows, the bigger the noise he makes and the higher the salary he commands. Heaven knows if I had but been ignorant instead of cultivated, and impudent instead of diffident, I could have made a name for myself in this cold, selfish world. I take my leave, sir. Since I have been treated as you have treated me, I am perfectly willing to go. But I have done my duty. I have fulfilled my contract as far as I was permitted to do it. I said I could make your paper of interest to all classes, and I have. I said I could run your circulation up to 20,000 copies, and if I had had 2 more weeks I'd have done it. And I'd have given you the best class of readers that ever an agricultural paper had, not a farmer in it, nor a solitary individual who could tell a watermelon tree from a peach vine to save his life. You are the loser by this rupture, not me, pie-plant. Adios. I then left. End of chapter 44. This is chapter 45 of Sketches New and Old. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Sketches New and Old by Mark Twain, chapter 45, The Petrified Man. Now, to show how really hard it is to foist a moral or a truth upon an unsuspecting public through a burlesque without entirely and absurdly missing one's mark, I will here set down 2 experiences of my own in this thing.
In the fall of 1862, in Nevada and California, the people got to running wild about extraordinary petrifactions and other natural marvels. One could scarcely pick up a paper without finding in it one or two glorified discoveries of this kind. The mania was becoming a little ridiculous. I was a brand-new local editor in Virginia City, and I felt called upon to destroy this growing evil. We all have our benignant fatherly moods at one time or another, I suppose. I chose to kill the petrifaction mania with a very delicate satire. But maybe it was altogether too delicate, for nobody ever perceived the satire part of it at all. I put my scheme in the shape of the discovery of a remarkably petrified man. I had had a temporary falling out with Mr. Blank, the new coroner and justice of the peace of Humboldt, and thought I might as well touch him up a little at the same time and make him ridiculous, and thus combine pleasure with business. So I told, in patient, belief-compelling detail, all about the finding of a petrified man at Gravely Ford, exactly 120 miles over a breakneck mountain trail from where Blank lived. How all the savants of the immediate neighborhood had been to examine it. It was notorious that there was not a living creature within 50 miles of there except a few starving Indians, some crippled grasshoppers, and 4 or 5 buzzards out of meat and too feeble to get away. How those savants all pronounced the petrified man to have been in a state of complete petrifaction for over 10 generations, and then, with a seriousness that I ought to have been ashamed to assume, I stated that as soon as Mr. Blank heard the news, he summoned a jury, mounted his mule, and posted off, with noble reverence for official duty, on that awful 5 days' journey, through alkali, sagebrush, peril of body, and imminent starvation, to hold an inquest on this man that had been dead and turned to everlasting stone for more than 300 years. And then, my hand being in, so to speak, I went on, with the same unflinching gravity, to state that the jury returned a verdict that deceased came to his death from protracted exposure. This only moved me to higher flights of imagination, and I said that the jury, with that charity so characteristic of pioneers, then dug a grave and were about to give the petrified man Christian burial, when they found that for ages a limestone sediment had been trickling down the face of the stone against which he was sitting, and this stuff had run under him and cemented him fast to the bedrock; that the jury, they were all silver miners, canvassed the difficulty a moment, and then got out their powder and fuse, and proceeded to drill a hole under him in order to blast him from his position, when Mr. Blank, with that delicacy so characteristic of him, forbade them, observing that it would be little less than sacrilege to do such a thing. From beginning to end, the petrified man's squib was a string of roaring absurdities, albeit they were told with an unfair pretense of truth that even imposed upon me to some extent, and I was in some danger of believing in my own fraud. But I really had no desire to deceive anybody, and no expectation of doing it. I depended on the way the petrified man was sitting to explain to the public that he was a swindle. Yet I purposely mixed that up with other things, hoping to make it obscure, and I did. I would describe the position of one foot, and then say his right thumb was against the side of his nose, then talk about his other foot, and presently come back and say the fingers of his right hand were spread apart, then talk about the back of his head a little, and return and say the left thumb was hooked into the right little finger, then ramble off about something else, and by drift back again and remark that the fingers of the left hand were spread like those of the right. But I was too ingenious. I mixed it up rather too much, and so all that description of the attitude, as a key to the humbuggery of the article, was entirely lost. For nobody but me ever discovered and comprehended the peculiar and suggestive position of the petrified man's hands. As a satire on the petrifaction mania, or anything else, my petrified man was a disheartening failure, for everybody received him in innocent good faith, and I was stunned to see the creature I had begotten to pull down the wonder business with, and bring derision upon it, calmly exalted to the grand chief place in the list of the genuine marvels our Nevada had produced. I was so disappointed at the curious miscarriage of my scheme that at first I was angry, and did not like to think about it. But by and by, when the exchanges began to come in with the Petrified man copied and guilelessly glorified, I began to feel a soothing secret satisfaction, and as my gentleman's field of travels broadened, and by the exchanges I saw that he steadily and implacably penetrated territory after territory, state after state, and land after land, till he swept the great globe and culminated in sublime and unimpeached legitimacy in the august London Lancet, my cup was full, and I said I was glad I had done it. I think that for about 11 months, as nearly as I can remember, Mr. Blank's daily mail-bag continued to be swollen by the addition of half a bushel of newspapers, hailing from many climes with the Petrified man in them, marked around with a prominent belt of ink. I sent them to him. I did it for spite, not for fun. He used to shovel them into his backyard and curse, and every day during all those months the miners, his constituents, for miners never quit joking a person when they get started, would call on him and ask if he could tell them where they could get hold of a paper with the Petrified man in it. He could have accommodated a continent with them. I hated Blank in those days, and these things pacified me and pleased me. I could not have gotten more real comfort out of him without killing him. End of chapter 45. This is chapter 46 of Sketches New and Old. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Sketches New and Old by Mark Twain, chapter 46, My Bloody Massacre. The other burlesque I have referred to was my fine satire upon the financial expedients of cooking dividends, a thing which became shamefully frequent on the Pacific coast for a while. Once more, in my self-complacent simplicity, I felt that the time had arrived for me to rise up and be a reformer. I put this reformatory satire in the shape of a fearful Masacre at Empire City. The San Francisco papers were making a great outcry about the iniquity of the Daney Silver Mining Company, whose directors had declared a cooked or false dividend for the purpose of increasing the value of their stock so that they could sell out at a comfortable figure and then scramble from under the tumbling concern. And while abusing the Daney, those papers did not forget to urge the public to get rid of all their silver stocks and invest in sound and safe San Francisco stocks, such as the Spring Valley Water Company, etc. But right at this unfortunate juncture, behold, the Spring Valley cooked a dividend too. And so, under the insidious mask of an invented bloody massacre, I stole upon the public unawares with my scathing satire upon the dividend cooking system. In about half a column of imaginary human carnage, I told how a citizen had murdered his wife and 9 children and then committed suicide. And I said slyly at the bottom that the sudden madness of which this melancholy massacre was the result had been brought about by his having allowed himself to be persuaded by the California papers to sell his sound and lucrative Nevada silver stocks, and buy into Spring Valley just in time to get cooked along with that company's fancy dividend, and sink every cent he had in the world. Ah, it was a deep, deep satire, and most ingeniously contrived, but I made the horrible details so carefully and conscientiously interesting that the public devoured them greedily, and wholly overlooked the following distinctly stated facts, to wit, the murderer was perfectly well known to every creature in the land as a bachelor, and consequently he could not murder his wife and 9 children. He murdered them in his splendid dressed stone mansion just in the edge of the great pine forest between Empire City and Dutch Nick's. There wasn't a solitary tree within 15 miles of either place. And finally, it was patent and notorious that Empire City and Dutch Nick's were one and the same place, and contained only 6 houses anyhow, and consequently there could be no forest between them, And on top of all these absurdities I stated that this diabolical murderer, after inflicting a wound upon himself that the reader ought to have seen would kill an elephant in the twinkling of an eye, jumped on his horse and rode 4 miles, waving his wife's reeking scalp in the air, and thus performing entered Carson City with tremendous éclat, and dropped dead in front of the chief's saloon, the envy and admiration of all beholders. Well, in all my life I never saw anything like the sensation that little satire created. It was the talk of the town. It was the talk of the territory. Most of the citizens dropped gently into it at breakfast, and they never finished their meal. There was something about those minutely faithful details that was a sufficing substitute for food. Few people that were able to read took food that morning. Dan and I, Dan was my repertorial associate, took our seats on either side of our customary table in the Eagle restaurant, and as I unfolded the shred they used to call a napkin in that establishment, I saw at the next table 2 stalwart innocents with that sort of vegetable dandruff sprinkled about their clothing, which was the sign and evidence that they were in from the Truckee with a load of hay. The one facing me had the morning paper folded to a long, narrow strip, and I knew, without any telling, that that strip represented the column that contained my pleasant financial satire. From the way he was excitedly mumbling, I saw that the heedless son of a hay-mow was skipping with all his might, in order to get to the bloody details as quickly as possible, and so he was missing the guide-boards I had set up to warn him that the whole thing was a fraud. Presently his eyes spread wide open, just as his jaws swung asunder to take in a potato approaching it on a fork. The potato halted, the face lit up redly, and the whole man was on fire with excitement. Then he broke into a disjointed checking off of the particulars, his potato cooling in mid-air meantime, and his mouth making a reach for it occasionally. But all was bringing up suddenly against a new and still more direful performance of my hero. At last he looked his stunned and rigid comrade impressively in the face and said, with an expression of concentrated awe, "Jim, he biled his baby, and he took the old woman's scalp. Cussed if I want any breakfast." And he laid his lingering potato reverently down, and he and his friend departed from the restaurant empty but satisfied. He never got down to where the satire part of it began. Nobody ever did. They found the thrilling particulars sufficient. To drop in with a poor little moral at the fag end of such a gorgeous massacre was like following the expiring sun with a candle and hope to attract the world's attention to it. The idea that anybody could ever take my massacre for a genuine occurrence never once suggested itself to me, hedged about as it was by all those telltale absurdities and impossibilities concerning the great pine forest, the dressed stone mansion, etc. But I found out then, and never have forgotten since, that we never read the dull explanatory surroundings of marvelously exciting things when we have no occasion to suppose that some irresponsible scribbler is trying to defraud us. We skip all that, and hasten to revel in the blood-curdling particulars, and be happy. End of chapter 46. This is chapter 47 of Sketches New and Old. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Sketches New and Old by Mark Twain, chapter 47, The Undertaker's Chat. "Now, that corpse," said the Undertaker, patting the folded hands of deceased approvingly, "was a brick. Every way you took him he was a brick. He was so real accommodating and so modest-like and simple in his last moments. Friends wanted a metallic burial case, nothing else would do. I couldn't get it. There weren't going to be time. Anybody could see that. Corpse said never mind, shake him up some kind of a box he could stretch out in comfortable. He warn't particular about the general style of it. Said he went more on room than style. Anyway, in a last final container. Friends wanted a silver door-plate on the coffin, signifying who he was and where he was from. Now, you know a fellow couldn't roust out such a gaily thing as that in a little country town like this. What did the corpse say? Corpse said, whitewash his old canoe and daub his address and general destination onto it with a blacking brush and a stencil plate,
along with a verse from some likely hymn or other, and pint him for the tomb, and mark him C.O.D., and just let him flicker. He warn't distressed any more than you be. On the contrary, just as ca'm and collected as a hearse horse. Said he judged that where he was going to, a body would find it considerable better to attract attention by a picturesque moral character than a natty burial case with a swell door-plate on it. Splendid man he was. I'd druther do for a corpse like that than any I've tackled in 7 year. There's some satisfaction in burying a man like that. You feel that what you're doing is appreciated. Lord bless you, so he's got planted before he spiled, he was perfectly satisfied. Said his relations meant well, perfectly well, but all them preparations was bound to delay the thing more or less, and he didn't wish to be kept laying around. You never see such a clear head as what he had, and so ca'm and so cool. Just a hunk of brains, that is what he was. Perfectly awful. It was a ripping distance from one end of that man's head to t'other. Often and over again he's had brain fever a-raging in one place, and the rest of the pile didn't know anything about it, didn't affect it any more than an Injun insurrection in Arizona affects the Atlantic States. Well, the relations, they wanted a big funeral, but Corpse said he was down on flummery, didn't want any procession, fill the hearse full of mourners, and get out a stern line and tow him behind. He was the most down on style of any remains I ever struck. A beautiful, simple-minded creature. It was what he was, you can depend on that. He was just set on having things the way he wanted them, and he took a solid comfort in laying his little plans. He had me measure him and take a whole raft of directions. Then he had the minister stand up behind a long box with a table, cloth over it to represent the coffin, and read his funeral sermon, saying "Angkor, Angkor" at the good places, and making him scratch out every bit of brag about him, and all the highfalutin', and then he made them trot out the choir, so he could help them pick out the tunes for the occasion, and he got them to sing "Pop Goes the Weasel," because he'd always liked that tune when he was downhearted and solemn music made him sad, and when they sung that with tears in their eyes, because they all loved him, and his relations grieving around, he just laid there as happy as a bug, and trying to beat time and showing all over how much he enjoyed it. And presently he got worked up and excited and tried to join in, for, mind you, he was pretty proud of his abilities in the singing line, but the first time he opened his mouth and was just going to spread himself, his breath took a walk. I never see a man snuffed out so sudden. It was a great loss, a powerful loss to this poor little one-horse town. Well, I ain't got time to be palavering along here. Got to nail on the lid and mosey along with him. And if you'll just give me a lift, we'll skeet him into the hearse and meander along. Relations bound to have it so. Don't pay no attention to dying injunctions, minute a corpse is gone. But if I had my way, if I didn't respect his last wishes and tow him behind the hearse, I'll be cussed. I consider that whatever a corpse wants done for his comfort is little enough matter, and a man ain't got no right to deceive him or take advantage of him. And whatever a corpse trusts me to do, I'm a-going to do, you know, even if it's to stuff him and paint him yaller and keep him for a keepsake, you hear me? He cracked his whip and went lumbering away with his ancient ruin of a hearse, and I continued my walk with a valuable lesson learned, that a healthy and wholesome cheerfulness is not necessarily impossible to any occupation. The lesson is likely to be lasting, for it will take many months to obliterate the memory of the remarks and circumstances that impressed it. End of chapter 47. This is chapter 48 of Sketches New and Old. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Sketches New and Old by Mark Twain, Chapter 48, Concerning Chambermaids. Against all chambermaids, of whatsoever age or nationality, I launch the curse of bachelordom, because they always put the pillows at the opposite end of the bed from the gas-burner, so that while you read and smoke before sleeping, as is the ancient and honored custom of bachelors, you have to hold your book aloft in an uncomfortable position to keep the light from dazzling your eyes. When they find the pillows removed to the other end of the bed in the morning, they receive not the suggestion in a friendly spirit, but, glorying in their absolute sovereignty, and unpitying your helplessness, they make the bed just as it was originally, and gloat in secret over the pang their tyranny will cause you. Always after that, when they find you have transposed the pillows, they undo your work, and thus defy and seek to embitter the life that God has given you. If they cannot get the light in an inconvenient position any other way, they move the bed. If you pull your trunk out 6 inches from the wall so that the lid will stay up when you open it, they always shove that trunk back again. They do it on purpose. If you want the spittoon in a certain spot where it will be handy, they don't, and so they move it. They always put your other boots into inaccessible places. They chiefly enjoy depositing them as far under the bed as the wall will permit. It is because this compels you to get down in an undignified attitude and make wild sweeps for them in the dark with the boot-jack and swear. They always put the matchbox in some other place. They hunt up a new place for it every day, and put up a bottle or other perishable glass thing where the box stood before. This is to cause you to break that glass thing groping in the dark, and get yourself into trouble. They are for ever and ever moving the furniture. When you come in the night, you can calculate on finding the bureau where the wardrobe was in the morning. And when you go out in the morning, if you leave the slop bucket by the door and rocking chair by the window, when you come in at midnight or thereabout, you will fall over that rocking chair, and you will proceed toward the window and sit down in that slop tub. This will disgust you. They like that. No matter where you put anything, they are not going to let it stay there. They will take it and move it the first chance they get. It is their nature. And besides, it gives them pleasure to be mean and contrary this way. They would die if they couldn't be villains. They always save up all the old scraps of printed rubbish you throw on the floor, and stack them up carefully on the table, and start the fire with your valuable manuscripts. If there is any one particular old scrap that you are more down on than any other, and which you are gradually wearing your life out trying to get rid of, you may take all the pains you possibly can in that direction, but it won't be of any use, because they will always fetch that old scrap back and put it in the same old place again every time. It does them good. And they use up more hair oil than any 6 men. If charged with purloining the same, they lie about it. What do they care about a hereafter? Absolutely nothing. If you leave the key in the door for convenience' sake, they will carry it down to the office and give it to the clerk. They do this under the vile pretense of trying to protect your property from thieves, but actually they do it because they want to make you tramp back downstairs after it when you come home tired, or put you to the trouble of sending a waiter for it, which waiter will expect you to pay him something, in which case I suppose the degraded creatures divide. They keep always trying to make your bed before you get up, thus destroying your rest and inflicting agony upon you, but after you get up, they don't come any more till next day. They do all the mean things they can think of, and they do them just out of pure cussedness and nothing else. Chambermaids are dead to every human instinct. If I can get a bill through the legislature abolishing chambermaids, I mean to do it. End of chapter 48. This is chapter 49 of Sketches New and Old. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Sketches New and Old by Mark Twain, chapter 49, Aurelia's Unfortunate Young Man. Written about 1865. The facts in the following case came to me by letter from a young lady who lives in the beautiful city of San Jose. She is perfectly unknown to me, and simply signs herself Aurelia Maria, which may possibly be a fictitious name. But no matter, the poor girl is almost heartbroken by the misfortunes she has undergone, and so confused by the conflicting counsels of misguided friends and insidious enemies
that she does not know what course to pursue in order to extricate herself from the web of difficulties in which she seems almost hopelessly involved. In this dilemma she turns to me for help, and supplicates for my guidance and instruction with a moving eloquence that would touch the heart of a statue. Hear her sad story. She says that when she was 16 years old she met and loved, with all the devotion of a passionate nature, a young man from New Jersey, named Williamson Breckenridge Caruthers, who was some 6 years her senior. They were engaged, with the free consent of their friends and relatives, and for a time it seemed as if their career was destined to be characterized by an immunity from sorrow beyond the usual lot of humanity. But at last the tide of fortune turned. Young Caruthers became infected with smallpox of the most virulent type, and when he recovered from his illness, his face was pitted like a waffle mold, and his comeliness gone forever. Aurelia thought to break off the engagement at first, but pity for her unfortunate lover caused her to postpone the marriage day for a season, and give him another trial. The very day before the wedding was to have taken place, Breckenridge, while absorbed in watching the flight of a balloon, walked into a well and fractured one of his legs, and it had to be taken off above the knee. Again Aurelia was moved to break the engagement, but again love triumphed, and she set the day forward, and gave him another chance to reform. And again misfortune overtook the unhappy youth. He lost one arm by the premature discharge of a 4th of July cannon, and within 3 months he got the other pulled out by a carding machine. Aurelia's heart was almost crushed by these latter calamities. She could not but be deeply grieved to see her lover passing from her by piecemeal, feeling, as she did, that he could not last forever under this disastrous process of reduction, yet knowing of no way to stop its dreadful career, and in her tearful despair she almost regretted, like brokers who hold on and lose, that she had not taken him at first, before he had suffered such an alarming depreciation. Still her brave soul bore her up, and she resolved to bear with her friend's unnatural disposition yet a little longer. Again the wedding day approached, and again disappointment overshadowed it. Caruthers fell ill with the erysipelas, and lost the use of one of his eyes entirely. The friends and relatives of the bride, considering that she had already put up with more than could reasonably be expected of her, now came forward and insisted that the match should be broken off. But after wavering a while, Aurelia, with a generous spirit which did her credit, said she had reflected calmly upon the matter, and could not discover that Breckenridge was to blame. So she extended the time once more, and he broke his other leg. It was a sad day for the poor girl when she saw the surgeons reverently bearing away the sack whose uses she had learned by previous experience, and her heart told her the bitter truth, that some more of her lover was gone. She felt that the field of her affections was growing more and more circumscribed every day, but once more she frowned down her relatives and renewed her betrothal. Shortly before the time set for the nuptials another disaster occurred. There was but one man scalped by the Owens River Indians last year. That man was Williamson Breckenridge Caruthers of New Jersey. He was hurrying home with happiness in his heart when he lost his hair forever, and in that hour of bitterness he almost cursed the mistaken mercy that had spared his head. At last Aurelia is in serious perplexity as to what she ought to do. She still loves her Breckenridge, she writes, with truly womanly feeling. She still loves what is left of him, but her parents are bitterly opposed to the match, because he has no property and is disabled from working, and she has not sufficient means to support both comfortably. Now, what should she do? She asked with painful and anxious solicitude. It is a delicate question. It is one which involves the lifelong happiness of a woman and that of nearly 2/3 of a man, and I feel that it would be assuming too great a responsibility to do more than make a mere suggestion in the case. How would it do to build to him? If Aurelia can afford the expense, let her furnish her mutilated lover with wooden arms and wooden legs, and a glass eye and a wig, and give him another show. Give him 90 days, without grace, and if he does not break his neck in the meantime, marry him and take the chances. It does not seem to me that there is much risk anyway, Aurelia, because if he sticks to his singular propensity for damaging himself every time he sees a good opportunity, his next experiment is bound to finish him, and then you are safe, married or single. If married, the wooden legs and such other valuables as he may possess revert to the widow, and you see you sustain no actual loss save the cherished fragment of a noble but most unfortunate husband, who honestly strove to do right, but whose extraordinary instincts were against him. Try it, Maria. I have thought the matter over carefully and well, and it is the only chance I see for you. It would have been a happy conceit on the part of Caruthers if he had started with his neck and broken that first. But since he has seen fit to choose a different policy and string himself out as long as possible, I do not think we ought to upbraid him for it if he has enjoyed it. We must do the best we can under the circumstances, and try not to feel exasperated at him. End of chapter 49. This is Chapter 50 of Sketches New and Old. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Sketches New and Old by Mark Twain, Chapter 50. After Jenkins. A grand affair of a ball, the Pioneers, came off at the Occidental some time ago. The following notes of the costumes worn by the belles of the occasion may not be uninteresting to the general reader, and Jenkins may get an idea therefrom. Mrs. W. M. was attired in an elegant pâté de foie gras, made expressly for her, and was greatly admired. Miss S. had her hair done up. She was the center of attraction for the gentlemen, and the envy of all the ladies. Mrs. G. W. was tastefully dressed in a tout ensemble, and was greeted with deafening applause wherever she went. Mrs. C. N. was superbly arrayed in white kid gloves. Her modest and engaging manner accorded well with the unpretending simplicity of her costume, and caused her to be regarded with absorbing interest by everyone. The charming Miss M. M. B. appeared in a thrilling waterfall, whose exceeding grace and volume compelled the homage of pioneers and emigrants alike. How beautiful she was! The queenly Mrs. L. R. was attractively attired in her new and beautiful false teeth, and the bonjour effect they naturally produced was heightened by her enchanting and well-sustained smile. Miss R. P., with that repugnance to ostentation in dress which is so peculiar to her, was attired in a simple white lace collar, fastened with a neat pearl button solitaire. The fine contrast between the sparkling vivacity of her natural optic and the steadfast attentiveness of her placid glass eye was the subject of general and enthusiastic remark. Miss C. L. B. had her fine nose elegantly enameled, and the easy grace with which she blew it from time to time marked her as a cultivated and accomplished woman of the world. Its exquisitely modulated tone excited the admiration of all who had the happiness to hear it. End of chapter 50. This is Chapter 51 of Sketches New and Old. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Sketches New and Old by Mark Twain, Chapter 51, about Barbers. All things change except barbers, the ways of barbers and the surroundings of barbers. These never change. What one experiences in a barber's shop the first time he enters one is what he always experiences in barbers' shops afterward till the end of his days. I got shaved this morning as usual. A man approached the door from Jones Street as I approached it from Main, a thing that always happens. I hurried up, but it was of no use. He entered the door one little step ahead of me, and I followed in on his heels and saw him take the only vacant chair, the one presided over by the best barber. It always happens so. I sat down, hoping that I might fall heir to the chair belonging to the better of the remaining two barbers, for he had already begun combing his man's hair, while his comrade was not yet quite done rubbing up and oiling his customer's locks. I watched the probabilities with strong interest. When I saw that number 2 was gaining on number 1, my interest grew to solicitude. When number 1 stopped a moment to make change on a bath ticket for a newcomer and lost ground in the race, my solicitude rose to anxiety. When number 1 caught up again, and both he and his comrade were pulling the towels away and brushing the powder from their customers' cheeks, and it was about an even thing which one would say next first, my very breath stood still with the suspense. But when at the culminating moment number 1 stopped to pass a comb a couple of times through his customer's eyebrows, I saw that he had lost the race by a single instant, and I rose indignant and quitted the shop, to keep from falling into the hands of number 2, for I have none of that enviable firmness that enables a man to look calmly into the eyes of a waiting barber and tell him he will wait for his fellow barber's chair. I stayed out 15 minutes, and then went back, hoping for better luck. Of course all the chairs were occupied now, and 4 men sat waiting, silent, unsociable, distraught, and looking bored, as men always do who are waiting their turn in a barber's shop. I sat down in one of the iron-armed compartments of an old sofa, and put in the time for a while reading the framed advertisements of all sorts of quack nostrums for dyeing and coloring the hair. Then I read the greasy names on the private bay-rum bottles, read the names and noted the numbers on the private shaving cups in the pigeonholes, studied the stained and damaged cheap prints on the walls of battles, early presidents, and voluptuous recumbent sultanas, and the tiresome and everlasting young girl putting her grandfather's spectacles on, execrated in my heart the cheerful canary and the distracting parrot that few barber shops are without. Finally, I searched out the least dilapidated of last year's illustrated papers that littered the foul center table, and conned their unjustifiable misrepresentations of old forgotten events. At last my turn came. A voice said, "Next," and I surrendered to number 2, of course. It always happens so. I said meekly that I was in a hurry, and it affected him as strongly as if he had never heard it. He shoved up my head and put a napkin under it. He plowed his fingers into my collar and fixed a towel there. He explored my hair with his claws and suggested that it needed trimming. I said I did not want it trimmed. He explored again and said it was pretty long for the present style, better have a little taken off. It needed it behind especially. I said I had had it cut only a week before. He yearned over it reflectively a moment, and then asked with a disparaging manner who cut it. I came back at him promptly with a "You did." I had him there. Then he fell to stirring up his lather and regarding himself in the glass, stopping now and then to get close and examine his chin critically or inspect a pimple. Then he lathered one side of my face thoroughly, and was about to lather the other, when a dog-fight attracted his attention, and he ran to the window and stayed and saw it out, losing 2 shillings on the result in bets with the other barbers, a thing which gave me great satisfaction. He finished lathering, and then began to rub in the suds with his hand. He now began to sharpen his razor on an old suspender, and was delayed a good deal on account of a controversy about a cheap masquerade ball he had figured at the night before, in red cambric and bogus ermine, as some kind of a king. He was so gratified with being chaffed about some damsel whom he had smitten with his charms, that he used every means to continue the controversy by pretending to be annoyed at the chaffings of his fellows. This matter begot more surveyings of himself in the glass, and he put down his razor and brushed his hair with elaborate care, plastering an inverted arch of it down on his forehead, accomplishing an accurate part behind, and brushing the 2 wings forward over his ears with nice exactness. In the meantime the lather was drying on my face and apparently eating into my vitals. Now he began to shave, digging his fingers into my countenance to stretch the skin, and bundling and tumbling my head this way and that as convenience in shaving demanded. As long as he was on the tough sides of my face I did not suffer, but when he began to rake and rip and tug at my chin, the tears came. He now made a handle of my nose to assist him shaving the corners of my upper lip, and it was by this bit of circumstantial evidence that I discovered that a part of his duties in the shop was to clean the kerosene lamps. I had often wondered in an indolent way whether the barbers did that, or whether it was the boss. About this time I was amusing myself trying to guess where he would be most likely to cut me this time, but he got ahead of me and sliced me on the end of the chin before I had got my mind made up. He immediately sharpened his razor. He might have done it before. I do not like a close shave, and would not let him go over me a second time. I tried to get him to put up his razor, dreading that he would make for the side of my chin, my pet tender spot, a place which a razor cannot touch twice without making trouble. But he said he only wanted to just smooth off one little roughness, and in the same moment he slipped his razor along the forbidden ground, and the dreaded pimple signs of a close shave rose up smarting and answered to the call. Now he soaked his towel in bay rum and slapped it all over my face nastily, slapped it over as if a human being ever yet washed his face in that way. Then he dried it by slapping with the dry part of the towel, as if a human being ever dried his face in such a fashion. But a barber seldom rubs you like a Christian. Next he poked bay rum into the cut place with his towel, then choked the wound with powdered starch, then soaked it with bay rum again, and would have gone on soaking and powdering it forevermore, no doubt, if I had not rebelled and begged off. He powdered my whole face now, straightened me up, and began to plow my hair thoughtfully with his hands. Then he suggested a shampoo, and said my hair needed it badly, very badly. I observed that I shampooed it myself very thoroughly in the bath yesterday. I had him again. He next recommended some of Smith's Hair Glorifier, and offered to sell me a bottle. I declined. He praised the new perfume, Joan's Delight of the Toilet, and proposed to sell me some of that. I declined again. He tendered me a tooth-wash atrocity of his own invention, and when I declined, offered to trade knives with me. He returned to business after the miscarriage of this last enterprise, sprinkled me all over, legs and all, greased my hair in defiance of my protest against it, rubbed and scrubbed a good deal of it out by the roots, and combed and brushed the rest, parting it behind and plastering the eternal inverted arch of hair down on my forehead, and then, while combing my scant eyebrows and defiling them with pomade, strung out an account of the achievements of a 6-ounce black and tan terrier of his till I heard the whistles blow for noon, and knew I was 5 minutes too late for the train. Then he snatched away the towel, brushed it lightly about my face, passed his comb through my eyebrows once more, and gaily sang out, "Next!" This barber fell down and died of apoplexy 2 hours later. I am waiting over a day for my revenge. I am going to attend his funeral. End of chapter 51. This is chapter 52 of Sketches New and Old. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Sketches New and Old by Mark Twain, chapter 52. Party Cries in Ireland. Belfast is a peculiarly religious community. This may be said of the whole of the north of Ireland. About one half of the people are Protestants and the other half Catholics. Each party does all it can to make its own doctrines popular and draw the affections of the irreligious toward them. One hears constantly of the most touching instances of this zeal. A week ago a vast concourse of Catholics assembled at Armagh to dedicate a new cathedral, and when they started home again the roadways were lined with groups of meek and lowly Protestants, who stoned them till all the region round about was marked with blood. I thought that only Catholics argued in that way, but it seems to be a mistake. Every man in the community is a missionary and carries a brick to admonish the erring with. The law has tried to break this up, but not with perfect success. It has decreed that irritating party cries shall not be indulged in, and that persons uttering them shall be fined 40 shillings and costs. And so, in the police court reports every day, one sees these fines recorded. Last week a girl of 12 years old was fined the usual 40 shillings and costs for proclaiming in the public streets that she was a Protestant. The usual cry is, "To hell with the Pope," or "To hell with the Protestants," according to the utterer's system of salvation. One of Belfast's local jokes was very good. It referred to the uniform and inevitable fine of 40 shillings and costs for uttering a party cry, and it is no economical fine for a poor man either, by the way. They say that a policeman found a drunken man lying on the ground, up a dark alley, entertaining himself with shouting, "To hell with! To hell with!" The officers smelt a fine. Informers get half. "What's that you say? To hell with! To hell with who? To hell with what?" "Ah, bedad, ye can finish it yourself. It's too expensive for me." I think the seditious disposition, restrained by the economical instinct, is finally put in that. End of chapter 52. This is chapter 53 of Sketches New and Old. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Sketches New and Old by Mark Twain, chapter 53, The Facts Concerning the Recent Resignation. Written about 1867. Washington, December 1867. I have resigned. The government appears to go on much the same, but there is a spoke out of its wheel, nevertheless. I was clerk of the Senate Committee on Conchology, and I have thrown up the position. I could see the plainest disposition on the part of the other members of the government to debar me from having any voice in the councils of the nation, and so I could no longer hold office and retain my self-respect. If I were to detail all the outrages that were heaped upon me during the 6 days that I was connected with the government in an official capacity, the narrative would fill a volume. They appointed me clerk of that committee on conchology, and then allowed me no amanuensis to play billiards with. I would have borne that, lonesome as it was, if I had met with that courtesy from the other members of the cabinet which was my due, but I did not. Whenever I observed that the head of a department was pursuing a wrong course, I laid down everything and went and tried to set him right, as it was my duty to do, and I never was thanked for it in a single instance. I went, with the best intentions in the world, to the Secretary of the Navy, and said, "Sir, I cannot see that Admiral Farragut is doing anything but skirmishing around there in Europe, having a sort of picnic. Now, that may be all very well, but it does not exhibit itself to me in that light. If there is no fighting for him to do, let him come home. There is no use in a man having a whole fleet for a pleasure excursion. It is too expensive. Mind, I do not object to pleasure excursions for the naval officers, pleasure excursions that are in reason, pleasure excursions that are economical. Now they might go down the Mississippi on a raft." You ought to have heard him storm. One would have supposed I had committed a crime of some kind, but I didn't mind. I said it was cheap and full of republican simplicity and perfectly safe. I said that, for a tranquil pleasure excursion, there was nothing equal to a raft. Then the Secretary of the Navy asked me who I was, and when I told him I was connected with the government, he wanted to know in what capacity. I said that, without remarking upon the singularity of such a question, coming as it did from a member of that same government, I would inform him that I was clerk of the Senate Committee on Conchology. Then there was a fine storm. He finished by ordering me to leave the premises, and give my attention strictly to my own business in future. My first impulse was to get him removed. However, that would harm others besides himself, and do me no real good, and so I let him stay. I went next to the Secretary of War, who was not inclined to see me at all until he learned that I was connected with the government. If I had not been on important business, I suppose I could not have got in. I asked him for a light. He was smoking at the time. And then I told him I had no fault to find with his defending the parole stipulations of General Lee and his comrades in arms, but that I could not approve of his method of fighting the Indians on the plains. I said he fought too scattering. He ought to get the Indians more together, get them together in some convenient place where he could have provisions enough for both parties, and then have a general massacre. I said there was nothing so convincing to an Indian as a general massacre. If he could not approve of the massacre, I said the next surest thing for an Indian was soap and education. Soap and education are not as sudden as a massacre, but they are more deadly in the long run, because a half-massacred Indian may recover, but if you educate him and wash him, it is bound to finish him some time or other. It undermines his constitution. It strikes at the foundation of his being. "Sir," I said, "the time has come when blood-curdling cruelty has become necessary. Inflict soap and a spelling-book on every Indian that ravages the plains, and let them die." The Secretary of War asked me if I was a member of the Cabinet, and I said I was. He inquired what position I held, and I said I was clerk of the Senate Committee on Conchology. I was then ordered under arrest for contempt of court, and restrained of my liberty for the best part of the day. I almost resolved to be silent thenceforward, and let the government get along the best way it could. But duty called, and I obeyed. I called on the Secretary of Treasury. He said, "What will you have?" The question threw me off my guard. I said, "Rum punch." He said, "If you have got any business here, sir, state it, and in as few words as possible." I then said that I was sorry he had seen fit to change the subject so abruptly, because such conduct was very offensive to me, but under the circumstances I would overlook the matter and come to the point. I now went into an earnest expostulation with him upon the extravagant length of his report. I said it was expensive, unnecessary, and awkwardly constructed. There were no descriptive passages in it, no poetry, no sentiment, no heroes, no plot, no pictures, not even woodcuts. Nobody would read it, that was a clear case. I urged him not to ruin his reputation by getting out a thing like that. If he ever hoped to succeed in literature, he must throw more variety into his writings. He must beware of dry detail. I said that the main popularity of the almanac was derived from its poetry and conundrums, and that a few conundrums distributed around through his Treasury report would help the sale of it more than all the internal revenue he could put into it. I said these things in the kindest spirit, and yet the Secretary of the Treasury fell into a violent passion. He even said I was an ass. He abused me in the most vindictive manner, and said that if I came there again meddling with his business he would throw me out of the window. I said I would take my hat and go if I could not be treated with the respect due to my office, and I did go. It was just like a new author. They always think they know more than anybody else when they are getting out their first book. Nobody can tell them anything. During the whole time that I was connected with the government it seemed as if I could not do anything in an official capacity without getting myself into trouble. And yet I did nothing, attempted nothing, but what I conceived to be for the good of my country. The sting of my wrongs may have driven me to unjust and harmful conclusions, but it surely seemed to me that the Secretary of State, the Secretary of War, the Secretary of the Treasury, and others of my confrères had conspired from the very beginning to drive me from the administration. I never attended but one cabinet meeting while I was connected with the government. That was sufficient for me. The servant at the White House door did not seem disposed to make way for me until I asked if the other members of the cabinet had arrived. He said they had, and I entered. They were all there, but nobody offered me a seat. They stared at me as if I had been an intruder. The President said, "Well, sir, who are you?" I handed him my card, and he read, "The Honorable Mark Twain, Clerk of the Senate Committee on Conchology." Then he looked at me from head to foot as if he had never heard of me before. The Secretary of the Treasury said, "This is the meddlesome ass that came to recommend me to put poetry and conundrums in my report, as if it were an almanac." The Secretary of War said, "It is the same visionary that came to me yesterday with a scheme to educate a portion of the Indians to death and massacre the balance." The Secretary of Navy said, "I recognize this youth as the person who has been interfering with my business time and again during the week. He is distressed about Admiral Farragut's using a whole fleet for a pleasure excursion, as he terms it. His proposition about some insane pleasure excursion on a raft is too absurd to repeat." I said, "Gentlemen, I perceive here a disposition to throw discredit upon every act of my official career. I perceive also a disposition to debar me from all voice in the councils of the nation.
No notice whatever was sent to me today. It was only by the merest chance that I learned that there was going to be a cabinet meeting. But let these things pass. All I wish to know is this a cabinet meeting or is it not?" The President said it was. "Then," I said, "let us proceed to business at once, and not fritter away valuable time in unbecoming fault-findings with each other's official conduct." The Secretary of State now spoke up in his benignant way, and said, "Young man, you are laboring under a mistake. The clerks of the Congressional committees are not members of the Cabinet. Neither are the doorkeepers of the Capitol, strange as it may seem. Therefore, much as we could desire your more than human wisdom in our deliberations, we cannot lawfully avail ourselves of it. The councils of the nation must proceed without you. If disaster follows, as follow full well it may, be it balm to your sorrowing spirit that by deed and voice you did what in you lay to avert it. You have my blessing. Farewell." These gentle words soothed my troubled breast, and I went away. But the servants of a nation can know no peace. I had hardly reached my den in the Capitol, and disposed my feet on the table like a representative, when one of the senators on the Conchological Committee came in a passion, and said, "Where have you been all day?" I observed that, if that was anybody's affair but my own, I had been to a cabinet meeting. "To a cabinet meeting? I would like to know what business you had at a cabinet meeting." I said I went there to consult, allowing for the sake of argument that he was in any wise concerned in the matter. He grew insolent then, and ended by saying that he had wanted me for 3 days past to copy a report on bombshells, eggshells, clamshells, and I don't know what all, connected with conchology, and nobody had been able to find me. This was too much. This was the feather that broke the clerical camel's back. I said, "Sir, do you suppose that I am going to work for $6 a day? If that is the idea, let me recommend the Senate Committee on Conchology to hire somebody else. I am the slave of no faction. Take back your degrading commission. Give me liberty or give me death." From that hour I was no longer connected with the government. Snubbed by the department, snubbed by the cabinet, snubbed at last by the chairman of a committee I was endeavoring to adorn, I yielded to persecution, cast far from me the perils and seductions of my great office, and forsook my bleeding country in the hour of her peril. But I had done the state some service, and I sent in my bill. The United States of America, in account with the Honorable Clerk of the Senate Committee on Conchology, to consultation with Secretary of War, $50. To consultation with Secretary of Navy, $50. To consultation with Secretary of the Treasury, $50. Cabinet consultation, no charge. To mileage to and from Jerusalem via Egypt, Algiers, Gibraltar, and Cadiz, 14,000 miles at 20 cents a mile, $2,800. To salary as clerk of Senate Committee on Conchology, 6 days at $6 per day, $36. Total, $2,986. Territorial delegates charge mileage both ways, although they never go back when they get here once. Why my mileage is denied me is more than I can understand. Not an item of this bill has been paid, except that trifle of $36 for clerkship salary. The Secretary of the Treasury, pursuing me to the last, drew his pen through all the other items, and simply marked in the margin, "Not allowed." So the dread alternative is embraced at last. Repudiation has begun. The nation is lost. I am done with official life for the present. Let those clerks who are willing to be imposed on remain. I know numbers of them in the departments who are never informed when there is to be a cabinet meeting, whose advice is never asked about war or finance or commerce by the heads of the nation, any more than if they were not connected with the government, and who actually stay in their offices day after day and work. They know their importance to the nation, and they unconsciously show it in their bearing, and the way they order their sustenance at the restaurant. But they work. I know one who has to paste all sorts of little scraps from the newspapers into a scrap-book,
sometimes as many as 8 or 10 scraps a day. He doesn't do it well, but he does it as well as he can. It is very fatiguing. It is exhausting to the intellect. Yet he only gets $1,800 a year. With a brain like his, that young man could amass thousands and thousands of dollars in some other pursuit if he chose to do it. But no, his heart is with his country, and he will serve her as long as she has got a scrapbook left. And I know clerks that don't know how to write very well, but such knowledge as they possess they nobly lay at the feet of their country, and toil on and suffer for $2,500 a year. What they write has to be written over again by other clerks sometimes, but when a man has done his best for his country, should his country complain? Then there are clerks that have no clerkships, and are waiting, and waiting, and waiting for a vacancy, waiting patiently for a chance to help their country out, and while they are waiting they only get barely $2,000 a year for it. It is sad. It is very, very sad. When a member of Congress has a friend who is gifted, but has no employment wherein his great powers may be brought to bear, he confers him upon his country, and gives him a clerkship in a department, and there that man has to slave his life out, fighting documents for the benefit of a nation that never thinks of him, never sympathizes with him, and all for $2,000 or $3,000 a year. When I shall have completed my list of all the clerks in the several departments, with my statement of what they have to do and what they get for it, you will see that there are not half enough clerks, and that what there are do not get half enough pay. End of chapter 53. This is chapter 54 of Sketches New and Old. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Sketches New and Old by Mark Twain, Chapter 54, History Repeats Itself. The following I find in a Sandwich Island paper which some friend has sent me from that tranquil far-off retreat. The coincidence between my own experience and that here set down by the late Mr. Benton is so remarkable that I cannot forbear publishing and commenting upon the paragraph. The Sandwich Island paper says, "How touching is this tribute of the late Hon. T.H. Benton to his mother's influence. My mother asked me never to use tobacco. I have never touched it from that time to the present day. She asked me not to gamble, and I have never gambled. I cannot tell who is losing in games that are being played. She admonished me, too, against liquor drinking, and whatever capacity for endurance I have at present, and whatever usefulness I may have attained through life, I attribute to having complied with her pious and correct wishes. When I was 7 years of age, she asked me not to drink, and then I made a resolution of total abstinence, and that I have adhered to it through all time I owe to my mother." I never saw anything so curious. It is almost an exact epitome of my own moral career, after simply substituting a grandmother for a mother. How well I remember my grandmother's asking me not to use tobacco. Good old soul! She said, "You're at it again, are you, you whelp? Now don't ever let me catch you chewing tobacco before breakfast again, or I lay I'll blacksnake you within an inch of your life." I have never touched it at that hour of the morning from that time to the present day. She asked me not to gamble. She whispered and said, "Put up those wicked cards this minute. 2 pair and a jack, you numbskull, and the other fellow's got a flush." I never have gambled from that day to this, never once, without a cold deck in my pocket. I cannot even tell who is going to lose in games that are being played unless I deal myself. When I was 2 years of age she asked me not to drink, and then I made a resolution of total abstinence. That I have adhered to it, and enjoyed the beneficent effects of it through all time, I owe to my grandmother. I have never drunk a drop from that day to this of any kind of water. End of chapter 54. This is chapter 55 of Sketches New and Old. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Sketches New and Old by Mark Twain, chapter 55, Honored as a Curiosity. If you get into conversation with a stranger in Honolulu and experience that natural desire to know what sort of ground you are treading on by finding out what manner of man your stranger is, strike out boldly and address him as Captain. Watch him narrowly, and if you see by his countenance that you are on the wrong track, ask him where he preaches. It is a safe bet that he is either a missionary or captain of a whaler. I became personally acquainted with 72 captains and 96 missionaries. The captains and ministers form one-half of the population. The third-fourth is composed of common Kanakas and mercantile foreigners and their families, and the final fourth is made up of high officers of the Hawaiian government. And there are just about cats enough for 3 apiece all around. A solemn stranger met me in the suburbs one day and said, "Good morning, your reverence. Preach in the stone church yonder, no doubt." "No, I don't. I'm not a preacher." "Really? I beg your pardon, Captain. I trust you had a good season. How much oil—" "Oil? Why, what do you take me for? I'm not a whaler." "Oh, I beg 1,000 pardons, your Excellency. Major General in the household troops, no doubt. Minister of the Interior, likely. Secretary of War. First Gentleman of the Bedchamber. Commissioner of the Royal—" "Stuff, man! I'm not connected in any way with the government." "Bless my life! Then who the mischief are you? What the mischief are you? And how the mischief did you get here? And where in thunder did you come from?" "I'm only a private personage, an unassuming stranger, lately arrived from America." "No, not a missionary, not a whaler, not a member of His Majesty's government, not even a Secretary of the Navy. Ah, heaven! It is too blissful to be true, alas! I do but dream. And yet that noble, honest countenance, those oblique, ingenuous eyes, that massive head, incapable of anything. Your hand, give me your hand, bright waif. Excuse these tears. For 16 weary years I have yearned for a moment like this, and—" Here his feelings were too much for him, and he swooned away. I pitied this poor creature from the bottom of my heart. I was deeply moved. I shed a few tears on him and kissed him for his mother. I then took what small change he had and shoved. End of chapter 55. This is chapter 56 of Sketches New and Old. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Sketches New and Old by Mark Twain, chapter 56, First Interview with Artemus Ward, written about 1870. I had never seen him before. He brought letters of introduction from mutual friends in San Francisco, and by invitation I breakfasted with him. It was almost religion, there in the silver mines, to precede such a meal with whiskey cocktails. Artemus, with the true cosmopolitan instinct, always deferred to the customs of the country he was in, and so he ordered 3 of those abominations. Hingston was present. I said I would rather not drink a whiskey cocktail. I said it would go right to my head, and confuse me so that I would be in a helpless tangle in 10 minutes. I did not want to act like a lunatic before strangers, but Artemus gently insisted, and I drank the treasonable mixture under protest, and felt all the time that I was doing a thing I might be sorry for. In a minute or two I began to imagine that my ideas were clouded. I waited in great anxiety for the conversation to open, with a sort of vague hope that my understanding would prove clear after all, and my misgivings groundless. Artemus dropped an unimportant remark or two, and then assumed a look of superhuman earnestness, and made the following astounding speech. He said, "Now, there is one thing I ought to ask you about before I forget it. You have been here in Silverland, here in Nevada, 2 or 3 years, and, of course, your position on the daily press has made it necessary for you to go down in the mines and examine them carefully in detail, and therefore you know all about the silver mining business. Now, what I want to get at well, the way the deposits of ore are made, you know. For instance, now,
As I understand it, the vein which contains the silver is sandwiched in between casings of granite, and runs along the ground, and sticks up like a curbstone. Well, take a vein 40 feet thick, for example, or 80 for that matter, or even 100. Say you go down on it with a shaft, straight down, or with what you call incline. Maybe you go down 500 feet, or maybe you don't go down but 200. Anyway, you go down, and all the time this vein grows narrower when the casings come nearer or approach each other, you may say. That is, when they do approach, which, of course, they do not always do, particularly in cases where the nature of the formation is such that they stand apart wider than they otherwise would, and which geology has failed to account for, although everything in that science goes to prove that, all things being equal, it would if it did not, or would not, certainly, if it did. And then, of course, they are. Do not you think it is? I said to myself, now, I just knew how it would be. That whiskey cocktail has done the business for me. I don't understand any more than a clam. And then I said aloud, that is, if you don't mind, would you say that over again? I ought— Oh, certainly, certainly. You see, I am very unfamiliar with the subject, and perhaps I don't present my case clearly, but No, you state it plain enough. But that cocktail has muddled me a little. But I will— No, I do understand for that matter, but I would get the hang of it all the better if you went over it again, and I'll pay better attention this time. He said, Why, what I was after was this. Here he became even more fearfully impressive than ever, and emphasized each particular point by checking it off on his finger ends. This vein, or lode, or ledge, or whatever you call it, runs along between two layers of granite, just the same as if it were a sandwich. Very well. Now suppose you go down on that, say 1,000 feet, or maybe 1,200, it don't really matter, before you drift, and then you start your drifts, some of them across the ledge, and others along the length of it, where the sulphurets— I believe they call them sulphurets, though why they should, considering that, so far as I can see, the main dependence of a miner does not so lie, as some suppose, but in which it cannot be successfully maintained, wherein the same should not continue, while part and parcel of the same, or not committed to either in the sense referred to, whereas, under different circumstances, the most inexperienced among us could not detect it if it were, or might overlook it if it did, or scorn the very idea of such a thing, even though it were palpably demonstrated as such. Am I not right? I said, sorrowfully, I feel ashamed of myself, Mr. Ward. I know I ought to understand you perfectly well, but you see that treacherous whiskey cocktail has got into my head, and now I cannot understand even the simplest proposition. I told you how it would be. Oh, don't mind it, don't mind it. The fault was my own, no doubt, though I did think it clear enough, for— Don't say a word. Clear. Why, you stated it as clear as the sun to anybody but an abject idiot. But it's that confounded cocktail that has played the mischief. No, now, don't say that. I'll begin it all over again, and— Don't now, for goodness' sake, don't do anything of the kind, because I tell you my head is in such a condition that I don't believe I could understand the most trifling question a man could ask me. Now, don't you be afraid. I'll put it so plain this time that you can't help but get the hang of it. We will begin at the very beginning. Leaning far across the table, with determined impressiveness wrought upon his every feature, and fingers prepared to keep tally of each point enumerated, and I, leaning forward with painful interest, resolved to comprehend or perish. You know the vein, the ledge, the thing that contains the metal, whereby it constitutes the medium between all other forces, whether of present or remote agencies, so brought to bear in favor of the former against the latter, or the latter against the former, or all or both, or compromising the relative differences existing within the radius whence culminate the several degree of similarity to which— I said, Oh, hang my wooden head, it ain't any use. It ain't any use to try. I can't understand anything.
The plainer you get it, the more I can't get the hang of it." I heard a suspicious noise behind me, and turned in time to see Hingston dodging behind a newspaper, and quaking with a gentle ecstasy of laughter. I looked at Ward again, and he had thrown off his dread solemnity and was laughing also. Then I saw that I had been sold, that I had been made a victim of a swindle in the way of a string of plausibly worded sentences that didn't mean anything under the sun. Artemus Ward was one of the best fellows in the world, and one of the most companionable. It has been said that he was not fluent in conversation, but, with the above experience in my mind, I differ. End of chapter 56. This is chapter 57 of Sketches New and Old. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Sketches New and Old by Mark Twain, Chapter 57, Cannibalism in the Cars, written about 1867. I visited St. Louis lately, and on my way west, after changing cars at Terre Haute, Indiana, a mild, benevolent-looking gentleman of about 45 or maybe 50 came in at one of the way stations and sat down beside me. We talked together pleasantly on various subjects for an hour, perhaps, and I found him exceedingly intelligent and entertaining. When he learned that I was from Washington, he immediately began to ask questions about various public men, and about congressional affairs, and I saw very shortly that I was conversing with a man who was perfectly familiar with the ins and outs of political life at the Capitol, even to the ways and manners and customs of procedure of senators and representatives in the chambers of the national legislature. Presently 2 men halted near us for a single moment, and one said to the other, "Harris, if you'll do that for me, I'll never forget you, my boy." My new comrade's eye lighted pleasantly. The words had touched upon a happy memory, I thought. Then his face settled into thoughtfulness, almost into gloom. He turned to me and said, "Let me tell you a story. Let me give you a secret chapter of my life, a chapter that has never been referred to by me since its events transpired. Listen patiently, and promise that you will not interrupt me." I said I would not, and he related the following strange adventure, speaking sometimes with animation, sometimes with melancholy, but always with feeling and earnestness. The Stranger's Narrative. On the 19th of December, 1853, I started from St. Louis on the evening train bound for Chicago. There were only 24 passengers, all told. There were no ladies and no children. We were in excellent spirits, and pleasant acquaintanceships were soon formed. The journey bade fair to be a happy one, and no individual in the party, I think, had even the vaguest presentiment of the horrors we were soon to undergo. At 11 p.m. it began to snow hard. Shortly after leaving the small village of Weldon, we entered upon that tremendous prairie solitude that stretches its leagues on leagues of houseless dreariness far away toward the Jubilee settlements. The winds, unobstructed by trees or hills or even vagrant rocks, whistled fiercely across the level desert, driving the falling snow before it like spray from the crested waves of a stormy sea. The snow was deepening fast, and we knew, by the diminished speed of the train, that the engine was plowing through it with steadily increasing difficulty. Indeed, it almost came to a dead halt sometimes in the midst of great drifts that piled themselves like colossal graves across the track. Conversation began to flag. Cheerfulness gave place to grave concern. The possibility of being imprisoned in the snow on the bleak prairie 50 miles from any house presented itself to every mind, and extended its depressing influence over every spirit. At 2 o'clock in the morning I was aroused out of an uneasy slumber by the ceasing of all motion about me. The appalling truth flashed upon me instantly. We were captives in a snowdrift. "All hands to the rescue!" Every man sprang to obey. Out into the wild night, the pitchy darkness, the billowy snow, the driving storm, every soul leapt with the consciousness that a moment lost now might bring destruction to us all. Shovels, hands, boards, anything, everything that could displace snow, was brought into instant requisition, It was a weird picture, that small company of frantic men fighting the banking snows, half in the blackest shadow and half in the angry light of the locomotive's reflector. One short hour sufficed to prove the utter uselessness of our efforts. The storm barricaded the track with a dozen drifts while we dug one away, and worse than this, it was discovered that the last grand charge the engine had made upon the enemy had broken the fore and aft shaft of the driving wheel. With a free track before us we should still have been helpless. We entered the car wearied with labor and very sorrowful. We gathered about the stoves and gravely canvassed our situation. We had no provisions whatever. In this lay our chief distress. We could not freeze, for there was a good supply of wood in the tender. This was our only comfort. The discussion ended at last in accepting the disheartening decision of the conductor, viz., that it would be death for any man to attempt to travel 50 miles on foot through snow like that. We could not send for help, and even if we could it would not come. We must submit and await, as patiently as we might, succor or starvation. I think the stoutest heart there felt a momentary chill when those words were uttered. Within the hour conversation subsided to a low murmur here and there about the car, caught fitfully between the rising and falling of the blast. The lamps grew dim, and the majority of the castaways settled themselves among the flickering shadows to think, to forget the present if they could, to sleep if they might. The eternal night, it surely seemed eternal to us, wore its lagging hours away at last, and the cold gray dawn broke in the east. As the light grew stronger, the passengers began to stir and give signs of life, one after another, and each in turn pushed his slouched hat up from his forehead, stretched his stiffened limbs, and glanced out of the windows upon the cheerless prospect. It was cheerless indeed. Not a living thing visible anywhere, not a human habitation, nothing but a vast white desert, uplifted sheets of snow drifting hither and thither before the wind, a world of eddying flakes shutting out the firmament above. All day we moped about the cars, saying little, thinking much. Another lingering dreary night, and hunger. Another dawning, another day of silence, sadness, wasting hunger, hopeless watching for succor that could not come. A night of restless slumber, filled with dreams of feasting, wakings distressed with the gnawings of hunger. The fourth day came and went, and the fifth. 5 days of dreadful imprisonment. A savage hunger looked out at every eye. There was in it a sign of awful import, the foreshadowing of a something that was vaguely shaping itself in every heart, a something which no tongue dared yet to frame into words. The 6th day passed, the 7th dawned upon as gaunt and haggard and hopeless a company of men as ever stood in the shadow of death. It must out now. That thing which had been growing up in every heart was ready to leap from every lip at last. Nature had been taxed to the utmost. She must yield. Richard H. Gaston of Minnesota, tall, cadaverous, and pale, rose up. All knew what was coming. All prepared. Every emotion, every semblance of excitement, was smothered. Only a calm, thoughtful seriousness appeared in the eyes that were lately so wild.
"Gentlemen, it cannot be delayed longer. The time is at hand. We must determine which of us shall die to furnish food for the rest."
Mr. John J. Williams of Illinois rose and said, "Gentlemen, I nominate the Reverend James Sawyer of Tennessee." Mr. William R. Adams of Indiana said,
"I nominate Mr. Daniel Slote of New York."
Mr. Charles J. Langdon, "I nominate Mr. Samuel A. Bowen of St. Louis." Mr. Slote, "Gentlemen, I desire to decline in favor of Mr. John A. Van Nostrum, Jr., of New Jersey." Mr. Gaston, "If there be no objection, the gentleman's desire will be acceded to." Mr. Van Nostrum objecting, the resignation of Mr. Slote was rejected. The resignations of Messrs. Sawyer and Bowen were also offered, and refused upon the same grounds. Mr. A. L. Bascom of Ohio. I move that the nominations now close, and that the House proceed to an election by ballot. Mr. Sawyer. Gentlemen, I protest earnestly against these proceedings. They are in every way irregular and unbecoming. I must beg to move that they be dropped at once, and that we elect a chairman of the meeting and proper officers to assist him, and then we can go on with the business before us understandingly. Mr. Bell of Iowa.
Gentlemen, I object. This is no time to stand upon forms and ceremonious observances. For more than 7 days we have been without food. Every moment we lose in idle discussion increases our distress. I am satisfied with the nominations that have been made. Every gentleman present is, I believe, and I, for one, do not see why we should not proceed at once to elect one or more of them. I wish to offer a resolution.
Mr. Gaston. It would be objected to, and have to lie over 1 day under the rules, thus bringing about the very delay you wish to avoid. The gentleman from New Jersey.
Mr. Van Nostrum.
Gentlemen, I am a stranger among you. I have not sought the distinction that has been conferred upon me, and I feel a delicacy.
Mr. Morgan of Alabama, interrupting.
I move the previous question. The motion was carried, and further debate shut off, of course. The motion to elect officers was passed, and under it Mr. Gaston was chosen chairman, Mr. Blake secretary, Messrs. Holcomb, Dyer, and Baldwin, a committee on nominations, and Mr. R. M. Howland, purveyor, to assist the committee in making selections. A recess of half an hour was then taken, and some little caucusing followed. At the sound of the gavel the meeting reassembled, and the committee reported in favor of Messrs. George Ferguson of Kentucky, Lucien Herman of Louisiana, and W. Messick of Colorado as candidates. The report was accepted. Mr. Rogers of Missouri. Mr. President, the report being properly before the House now, I move to amend it by substituting for the name of Mr. Herman that of Mr. Lucius Harris of St. Louis, who is well and honorably known to us all. I do not wish to be understood as casting the least reflection upon the high character and standing of the gentleman from Louisiana. Far from it. I respect and esteem him as much as any gentleman here present possibly can. But none of us can be blind to the fact that he has lost more flesh during the week that we have lain here than any among us. None of us can be blind to the fact that the committee has been derelict in its duty, either through negligence or a graver fault, in thus offering for our suffrages a gentleman who, however pure his own motives may be, has really less nutriment in him. The Chair. The gentleman from Missouri will take his seat. The Chair cannot allow the integrity of the committee to be questioned save by the regular course, under the rules. What action will the House take upon the gentleman's motion? Mr. Halliday of Virginia. I move to further amend the report by substituting Mr. Harvey Davis of Oregon for Mr. Messick. It may be urged by gentlemen that the hardships and privations of a frontier life have rendered Mr. Davis tough, but, gentlemen, is this a time to cavil at toughness? Is this a time to be fastidious concerning trifles? Is this a time to dispute about matters of paltry significance? No, gentlemen, bulk is what we desire. Substance, weight, bulk. These are the supreme requisites now, not talent, not genius, not education. I insist upon my motion.
Mr. Morgan, excitedly.
Mr. Chairman, I do most strenuously object to this amendment. The gentleman from Oregon is old, and furthermore is bulky only in bone, not in flesh. I ask the gentleman from Virginia if it is soup we want instead of solid sustenance, if he would delude us with shadows, if he would mock our suffering with an Oregonian specter. I ask him if he can look upon the anxious faces around him, if he can gaze into our sad eyes, if he can listen to the beating of our expectant hearts, and still thrust this famine-stricken fraud upon us. I ask him if he can think of our desolate state, of our past sorrows, of our dark future, and still unpityingly foist upon us this wreck, this ruin, this tottering swindle, this gnarled and blighted and sapless vagabond from Oregon's inhospitable shores. Never! Applause. The amendment was put to vote after a fiery debate, and lost. Mr. Harris was substituted on the first amendment. The balloting then began. 5 ballots were held without a choice. On the 6th Mr. Harris was elected, all voting for him but himself. It was then moved that his election should be ratified by acclamation, which was lost in consequence of his again voting against himself. Mr. Radway moved that the House now take up the remaining candidates and go into an election for breakfast. This was carried. On the first ballot there was a tie, half the members favoring one candidate on account of his youth, and half favoring the other on account of his superior size. The President gave the casting vote for the latter, Mr. Messick. This decision created considerable dissatisfaction among the friends of Mr. Ferguson, the defeated candidate, and there was some talk of demanding a new ballot, but in the midst of it a motion to adjourn was carried, and the meeting broke up at once. The preparations for supper diverted the attention of the Ferguson faction from the discussion of their grievances for a long time, and then, when they would have taken it up again, the happy announcement that Mr. Harris was ready drove all thought of it to the winds. We improvised tables by propping up the backs of car seats, and sat down with hearts full of gratitude to the finest supper that had blessed our vision for 7 torturing days. How changed we were from what we had been a few short hours before! Hopeless, sad-eyed misery, hunger, feverish anxiety, desperation, then; thankfulness, serenity, joy too deep for utterance, now. That, I know, was the cheeriest hour of my eventful life. The winds howled, and blew the snow wildly about our prison house, but they were powerless to distress us any more. I liked Harris. He might have been better done, perhaps, but I am free to say that no man ever agreed with me better than Harris, or afforded me so large a degree of satisfaction. Messick was very well, though rather high-flavored, but for genuine nutritiousness and delicacy of fiber, give me Harris. Messick had his good points, I will not attempt to deny it, nor do I wish to do it, but he was no more fitted for breakfast than a mummy would be, sir, not a bit. Lean? Why, bless me! And tough? Ah, he was very tough. You could not imagine it. You could never imagine anything like it. Do you mean to tell me that— Do not interrupt me, please. After breakfast we elected a man by the name of Walker from Detroit for supper. He was very good. I wrote his wife so afterward. He was worthy of all praise. I shall always remember Walker. He was a little rare, but very good. And then the next morning we had Morgan of Alabama for breakfast. He was one of the finest men I ever sat down to. Handsome, educated, refined, spoke several languages fluently. A perfect gentleman. He was a perfect gentleman, and singularly juicy. For supper we had that Oregon patriarch, and he was a fraud. There is no question about it. Old, scraggy, tough, nobody can picture the reality. I finally said, "Gentlemen, you can do as you like, but I will wait for another election." And Grimes of Illinois said, "Gentlemen, I will wait also. When you elect a man that has something to recommend him, I shall be glad to join you again." It soon became evident that there was general dissatisfaction with Davis of Oregon, and so, to preserve the good will that had prevailed so pleasantly since we had had Harris, an election was called, and the result of it was that Baker of Georgia was chosen. He was splendid. Well, well, after that we had Doolittle and Hawkins and McElroy. There was some complaint about McElroy, because he was uncommonly short and thin. And Penrod, and 2 Smiths, and Bailey. Bailey had a wooden leg, which was clear loss, but he was otherwise good. And an Indian boy, and an organ grinder, and a gentleman by the name of Buckminster, a poor stick of a vagabond that wasn't any good for company and no account for breakfast. We were glad we got him elected before relief came.
And so the blessed relief did come at last?
Yes, it came one bright sunny morning just after election. John Murphy was the choice, and there never was a better, I am willing to testify. But John Murphy came home with us, in the train that came to succor us, and lived to marry the widow Harris.
Relict of
our first choice. He married her, and is happy and respected and prosperous yet. It was like a novel, sir. It was like a romance. This is my stopping place, sir. I must bid you good-bye. Any time that you make it convenient to tarry a day or two with me, I shall be glad to have you. I like you, sir. I have conceived an affection for you. I could like you as well as I liked Harris himself, sir. Good day, sir, and a pleasant journey." He was gone. I never felt so stunned, so distressed, so bewildered in my life. But in my soul I was glad he was gone. With all his gentleness of manner and his soft voice, I shuddered whenever he turned his hungry eye upon me, and when I heard that I had achieved his perilous affection, and that I stood almost with the late Harris in his esteem, my heart fairly stood still. I was bewildered beyond description. I did not doubt his word. I could not question a single item in a statement so stamped with the earnestness of truth as his, but its dreadful details overpowered me and threw my thoughts into hopeless confusion. I saw the conductor looking at me. I said, "Who is that man?" "He was a member of Congress once, and a good one, but he got caught in a snowdrift in the cars, and like to have been starved to death. He got so frostbitten and frozen up generally, and used up for want of something to eat, that he was sick and out of his head 2 or 3 months afterward. He's all right now, only he is a monomaniac, and when he gets on that old subject he never stops till he has eat up that whole carload of people he talks about. He would have finished the crowd by this time, only he had to get out here. He has got their names as pat as ABC. When he gets them all eat up, but himself, he always says, 'Then the hour for the usual election for breakfast having arrived, and there being no opposition, I was duly elected, after which, there being no objections offered, I resigned. Thus I am here.'" I felt inexpressibly relieved to know that I had only been listening to the harmless vagaries of a madman, instead of the genuine experiences of a bloodthirsty cannibal. End of chapter 57.
This is Chapter 58 of Sketches New and Old. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Sketches New and Old by Mark Twain, Chapter 58, The Killing of Julius Caesar, Localized, written about 1865, being the only true and reliable account ever published, taken from the Roman daily evening fasces of the date of that tremendous occurrence. Nothing in the world affords a newspaper reporter so much satisfaction as gathering up the details of a bloody and mysterious murder and writing them up with aggravating circumstantiality. He takes a living delight in this labor of love, for such it is to him, especially if he knows that all the other papers have gone to press, and his will be the only one that will contain the dreadful intelligence. A feeling of regret has often come over me that I was not reporting in Rome when Caesar was killed, reporting on an evening paper, and the only one in the city, and getting at least 12 hours ahead of the morning paper boys with this most magnificent item that ever fell to the lot of the craft. Other events have happened as startling as this, but none that possess so peculiarly all the characteristics of the favorite item of the present day, magnified into grandeur and sublimity by the high rank, fame, and social and political standing of the actors in it. However, as I was not permitted to report Caesar's assassination in the regular way, it has at least afforded me rare satisfaction to translate the following able account of it from the original Latin of the Roman daily evening fasces of that date, 2nd edition. Our usually quiet city of Rome was thrown into a state of wild excitement yesterday by the occurrence of one of those bloody affrays which sicken the heart and fill the soul with fear, while they inspire all thinking men with forebodings for the future of a city where human life is held so cheaply and the gravest laws are so openly set at defiance. As the result of that affray, it is our painful duty as public journalists to record the death of one of our most esteemed citizens, a man whose name is known wherever this paper circulates, and whose fame it has been our pleasure and our privilege to extend, and also to protect from the tongue of slander and falsehood, to the best of our poor ability. We refer to Mr. J. Caesar, the Emperor-elect. The facts of the case, as nearly as our reporter could determine them from the conflicting statements of eyewitnesses, were about as follows. The affair was an election row, of course. 9/10 of the ghastly butcheries that disgrace the city nowadays grow out of the bickerings and jealousies and animosities engendered by these accursed elections. Rome would be the gainer by it if her very constables were elected to serve a century, for in our experience we have never even been able to choose a dog-pelter without celebrating the event with a dozen knockdowns and a general cramming of the station-house with drunken vagabonds overnight. It is said that when the immense majority for Caesar at the polls in the market was declared the other day, and the crown was offered to that gentleman, even his amazing unselfishness in refusing it 3 times was not sufficient to save him from the whispered insults of such men as Casca of the 10th Ward, and other hirelings of the disappointed candidate, hailing mostly from the 11th and 13th and other outside districts, who were overheard speaking ironically and contemptuously of Mr. Caesar's conduct upon that occasion. We are further informed that there are many among us who think they are justified in believing that the assassination of Julius Caesar was a put-up thing, a cut-and-dried arrangement, hatched by Marcus Brutus and a lot of his hired roughs, and carried out only too faithfully according to the program. Whether there be good grounds for this suspicion or not, we leave to the people to judge for themselves, only asking that they will read the following account of the sad occurrence carefully and dispassionately before they render that judgment. The Senate was already in session, and Caesar was coming down the street toward the Capitol, conversing with some personal friends, and followed as usual by a large number of citizens. Just as he was passing in front of Demosthenes and Thucydides' drug-store, he was observing casually to a gentleman, who our informant thinks is a fortune-teller, that the Ides of March were come. The reply was, "Yes, they are come, but not gone yet." At this moment Artemidorus stepped up and passed the time of day, and asked Caesar to read a schedule, or a tract, or something of the kind, which he had brought for his perusal. Mr. Decius Brutus also said something about an humble suit, which he wanted read. Artemidorus begged that attention might be paid to his first, because it was of personal consequence to Caesar. The latter replied that what concerned himself should be read last, or words to that effect. Artemidorus begged and beseeched him to read the paper instantly. Mark that. It is hinted by William Shakespeare, who saw the beginning and the end of the unfortunate affray, that this schedule was simply a note discovering to Caesar that a plot was brewing to take his life. However, Caesar shook him off, and refused to read any petition in the street. He then entered the Capitol, and the crowd followed him. About this time the following conversation was overheard, and we consider that, taken in connection with the events which succeeded it, it bears an appalling significance. Mr. Papilius Lena remarked to George W. Cassius, commonly known as the Nobby Boy of the 3rd Ward, a bruiser in the pay of the opposition, that he hoped his enterprise today might thrive, and when Cassius asked, "What enterprise?" he only closed his left eye temporarily and said with simulated indifference, "Very well," and sauntered toward Caesar. Marcus Brutus, who is suspected of being the ringleader of the band that killed Caesar, asked what it was that Lena had said. Cassius told him, and added in a low tone, "I fear our purpose is discovered." Brutus told his wretched accomplice to keep an eye on Lena, and a moment after Cassius urged that lean and hungry vagrant Casca, whose reputation here is none of the best, to be sudden, for he feared prevention. He then turned to Brutus, apparently much excited, and asked what should be done, and swore that either he or Caesar would never turn back. He would kill himself first. At this time Caesar was talking to some of the back-country members about the approaching fall elections, and paying little attention to what was going on around him. Billy Trebonius got into conversation with the people's friend and Caesar's, Mark Antony, and under some pretense or other got him away, and Brutus, Decius, Casca, Cinna, Metellus Cimber, and others of the gang of infamous desperadoes that infest Rome at present, closed around the doomed Caesar. Then Metellus Cimber knelt down and begged that his brother might be recalled from banishment, but Caesar rebuked him for his fawning conduct, and refused to grant his petition. Immediately, at Cimber's request, first Brutus and then Cassius begged for the return of the banished Publius, but Caesar still refused. He said he could not be moved, that he was as fixed as the North Star, and proceeded to speak in the most complimentary terms of the firmness of that star and its steady character. Then he said he was like it, and he believed he was the only man in the country that was. Therefore, since he was constant that Cimber should be banished, he was also constant that he should stay banished, and he'd be hanged if he didn't keep him so. Instantly seizing upon this shallow pretext for a fight, Casca sprang at Caesar and struck him with a dirk, Caesar grabbing him by the arm with his right hand, and launching a blow straight from the shoulder with his left that sent the reptile bleeding to the earth. He then backed up against Pompey's statue, and squared himself to receive his assailants. Cassius and Cimber and Cinna rushed upon him with their daggers drawn, and the former succeeded in inflicting a wound upon his body. But before he could strike again, and before either of the others could strike at all, Caesar stretched the three miscreants at his feet with as many blows of his powerful fist. By this time the Senate was in an indescribable uproar. The throng of citizens in the lobbies had blockaded the doors in their frantic efforts to escape from the building. The sergeant-at-arms and his assistants were struggling with the assassins. Venerable senators had cast aside their encumbering robes, and were leaping over benches and flying down the aisles in wild confusion toward the shelter of the committee rooms, and 1,000 voices were shouting, "Police! Police!" in discordant tones that rose above the frightful din, like shrieking winds above the roaring of a tempest. And amid it all great Caesar stood with his back against the statue, like a lion at bay, and fought his assailants weaponless and hand to hand, with the defiant bearing and the unwavering courage which he had shown before on many a bloody field. Billy Trebonius and Caius Ligarius struck him with their daggers and fell, as their brother conspirators before them had fallen. But at last, when Caesar saw his old friend Brutus step forward armed with a murderous knife, it is said he seemed utterly overpowered with grief and amazement, and, dropping his invincible left arm by his side, he hid his face in the folds of his mantle, and received the treacherous blow without an effort to stay the hand that gave it. He only said, "Et tu, Brute?" and fell lifeless on the marble pavement. We learn that the coat deceased had on when he was killed was the same one he wore in his tent on the afternoon of the day he overcame the Nervi, and that when it was removed from the corpse it was found to be cut and gashed in no less than 7 different places. There was nothing in the pockets. It will be exhibited at the coroner's inquest, and will be damning proof of the fact of the killing. These latter facts may be relied on, as we get them from Mark Antony, whose position enables him to learn every item of news connected with the one subject of absorbing interest of today. Later, while the coroner was summoning a jury, Mark Antony and other friends of the late Caesar got hold of the body and lugged it off to the Forum, and at last accounts Antony and Brutus were making speeches over it and raising such a row among the people that, as we go to press, the chief of police is satisfied there is going to be a riot, and is taking measures accordingly. End of chapter 58. This is chapter 59 of Sketches New and Old. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Sketches New and Old by Mark Twain, chapter 59, The Widow's Protest.
"One of the saddest things that ever came under my notice," said the banker's clerk, "was there in Corning during the war. Dan Murphy enlisted as a private and fought very bravely. The boys all liked him, and when a wound by and by weakened him down till carrying a musket was too heavy work for him, they clubbed together and fixed him up as a sutler. He made money then, and sent it always to his wife to bank for him. She was a washer and an ironer, and knew enough by hard experience to keep money when she got it. She didn't waste a penny. On the contrary, she began to get miserly as her bank account grew. She grieved to part with a cent, poor creature, for twice in her hard-working life she had known what it was to be hungry, cold, friendless, sick, and without a dollar in the world, and she had a haunting dread of suffering so again. Well, at last Dan died, and the boys, in testimony of their esteem and respect for him, telegraphed to Mrs. Murphy to know if she would like to have him embalmed and sent home, when you know the usual custom was to dump a poor devil like him into a shallow hole and then inform his friends what had become of him. Mrs. Murphy jumped to the conclusion that it would only cost $2 or $3 to embalm her dead husband, and so she telegraphed yes. It was at the wake that the bill for embalming arrived and was presented to the widow. She uttered a wild, sad wail that pierced every heart, and said, $75 for stuffing Dan! Blister their souls! Did them divils suppose I was going to start a museum, that I'd be dealing in such expensive curiosities? The banker's clerk said there was not a dry eye in the house. End of chapter 59. This is Chapter 60 of Sketches New and Old. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Sketches New and Old by Mark Twain, Chapter 60, The Scriptural Panoramist, written about 1866. "There was a fellow traveling around in that country," said Mr. Nickerson, "with a moral religious show, a sort of scriptural panorama, and he hired a wooden-headed old slab to play the piano for him. After the first night's performance, the showman says, 'My friend, you seem to know pretty much all the tunes there are, and you worry along first rate. But then, didn't you notice that sometimes last night the piece you happened to be playing was a little rough on the proprieties, so to speak, didn't seem to jibe with the general gait of the picture that was passing at the time, as it were, was a little foreign to the subject, you know, as if you didn't either trump or follow suit, you understand?' Well, no, the fellow said he hadn't noticed, but it might be he had played along just as it came handy. So they put it up that the simple old dummy was to keep his eye on the panorama after that, and as soon as the stunning picture was reeled out, he was to fit it to a dot with a piece of music that would help the audience to get the idea of the subject, and warm them up like a camp-meeting revival. That sort of thing would collar their sympathies, the showman said. There was a big audience that night, mostly middle-aged and old people who belonged to the church and took a strong interest in Bible matters, and the balance were pretty much young bucks and heifers. They always come out strong on panoramas, you know, because it gives them a chance to taste one another's complexions in the dark. Well, the showman began to swell himself up for his lecture, and the old mud-jobber tackled the piano and ran his fingers up and down once or twice to see that she was all right, and the fellows behind the curtain commenced to grind out the panorama. The showman balanced his weight on his right foot and propped his hands over his hips and flung his eyes over his shoulder at the scenery and said, "Ladies and gentlemen, the painting now before you illustrates the beautiful and touching parable of the prodigal son. Observe the happy expression just breaking over the features of the poor suffering youth, so worn and weary with his long march. Note also the ecstasy beaming from the uplifted countenance of the aged father, and the joy that sparkles in the eyes of the excited group of youths and maidens, and seems ready to burst into the welcoming chorus from their lips. The lesson, my friends, is as solemn and instructive as the story is tender and beautiful." The mud-jobber was all ready, and when the second speech was finished, struck up, "Oh, we'll all get blind drunk when Johnny comes marching home." Now, some of the people giggled, and some groaned a little. The showman couldn't say a word. He looked at the pianist sharp, but he was all lovely and serene. He didn't know there was anything out of gear. The panorama moved on, and the showman drummed up his grit and started in fresh. "Ladies and gentlemen, The fine picture now unfolding itself to your gaze exhibits one of the most notable events in Bible history, our Savior and his disciples upon the Sea of Galilee. How grand, how awe-inspiring are the reflections which the subject invokes! What sublimity of faith is revealed to us in this lesson from the sacred writings! The Savior rebukes the angry waves and walks securely upon the bosom of the deep. All around the house they were whispering, "Oh, how lovely, how beautiful!" and the orchestra let himself out again, "A life on the ocean wave, and a home on the rolling deep." There was a good deal of honest snickering turned on this time, and considerable groaning, and one or two old deacons got up and went out. The showman grated his teeth, and cursed the piano man to himself, but the fellow sat there like a knot on a log, and seemed to think he was doing first rate. After things got quiet, the showman thought he would make one more stagger at it anyway, though his confidence was beginning to get mighty shaky. The soup started the panorama grinding along again, and he says, "Ladies and gentlemen, this exquisite painting represents the raising of Lazarus from the dead by our Savior. The subject has been handled with marvelous skill by the artist, and such touching sweetness and tenderness of expression has he thrown into it that I have known peculiarly sensitive persons to be even affected to tears by looking at it. Observe the half-confused, half-inquiring look upon the countenance of the awakened Lazarus. Observe also the attitude and expression of the Savior, who takes him gently by the sleeve of his shroud with one hand, while he points with the other toward the distant city." Before anybody could get off an opinion in the case, the innocent old ass at the piano struck up, "Come rise up, William Riley, and go along with me." Phew! All the solemn old flats got up in a huff to go, and everybody else laughed till the windows rattled. The showman went down and grabbed the orchestra and shook him up and says, "That lets you out, you know, you chowder-headed old clam. Go to the doorkeeper and get your money, and cut your stick, vamoose the ranch. Ladies and gentlemen, circumstances over which I have no control compel me prematurely to dismiss the house."
End of chapter 60. This is Chapter 61 of Sketches New and Old. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Sketches New and Old by Mark Twain, Chapter 61, Curing a Cold, written about 1864. It is a good thing, perhaps, to write for the amusement of the public, but it is a far higher and nobler thing to write for their instruction, their profit, their actual and tangible benefit. The latter is the sole object of this article. If it prove the means of restoring to health one solitary sufferer among my race, of lighting up once more the fire of hope and joy in his faded eyes, of bringing back to his dead heart again the quick, generous impulses of other days, I shall be amply rewarded for my labor. My soul will be permeated with the sacred delight a Christian feels when he has done a good, unselfish deed. Having led a pure and blameless life, I am justified in believing that no man who knows me will reject the suggestions I am about to make out of fear that I am trying to deceive him. Let the public do itself the honor to read my experience in doctoring a cold, as herein set forth, and then follow in my footsteps. When the White House was burned in Virginia City, I lost my home, my happiness, my Constitution, and my trunk. The loss of the two first-named articles was a matter of no great consequence, since a home without a mother or a sister or a distant young female relative in it, to remind you, by putting your soiled linen out of sight and taking your boots down off the mantelpiece, that there are those who think about you and care for you, is easily obtained. And I cared nothing for the loss of my happiness, because, not being a poet, it could not be possible that melancholy would abide with me long. But to lose a good constitution and a better trunk were serious misfortunes. On the day of the fire my constitution succumbed to a severe cold, caused by undue exertion in getting ready to do something. I suffered to no purpose, too, because the plan I was figuring at for the extinguishing of the fire was so elaborate that I never got it completed until the middle of the following week. The first time I began to sneeze, a friend told me to go and bathe my feet in hot water and go to bed. I did so. Shortly afterwards another friend advised me to get up and take a cold shower bath. I did that also. Within the hour another friend assured me that it was policy to feed a cold and starve a fever. I had both, so I thought it best to fill myself up for the cold and then keep dark and let the fever starve a while. In a case of this kind I seldom do things by halves. I ate pretty heartily. I conferred my custom upon a stranger who had just opened his restaurant that morning. He waited near me in respectful silence until I had finished feeding my cold, when he inquired if the people about Virginia City were much afflicted with colds. I told him I thought they were. He then went out and took in his sign. I started down toward the office, and on the way encountered another bosom friend, who told me that a quart of salt water, taken warm, would come as near curing a cold as anything in the world. I hardly thought I had room for it, but I tried it anyhow. The result was surprising. I believed I had thrown up my immortal soul. Now, as I am giving my experience only for the benefit of those who are troubled with the distemper I am writing about, I feel that they will see the propriety of my cautioning them against following such portions of it as proved inefficient with me, and acting upon this conviction, I warn them against warm salt water. It may be a good enough remedy, but I think it is too severe. If I had another cold in the head, and there were no course left me but to take either an earthquake or a quart of warm salt water, I would take my chances on the earthquake. After the storm which had been raging in my stomach had subsided, and no more good Samaritans happening along, I went on borrowing handkerchiefs again and blowing them to atoms, as had been my custom in the early stages of my cold, until I came across a lady who had just arrived from over the plains, and who said she had lived in a part of the country where doctors were scarce, and had from necessity acquired considerable skill in the treatment of simple family complaints. I knew she must have had much experience, for she appeared to be 150 years old. She mixed a decoction composed of molasses, aquafortis, turpentine, and various other drugs, and instructed me to take a wine-glass full of it every 15 minutes. I never took but one dose. That was enough. It robbed me of all moral principle, and awoke every unworthy impulse of my nature. Under its malign influence my brain conceived miracles of meanness, but my hands were too feeble to execute them. At that time, had it not been that my strength had surrendered to a succession of assaults from infallible remedies for my cold, I am satisfied that I would have tried to rob the graveyard. Like most other people, I often feel mean and act accordingly, but until I took that medicine I had never reveled in such supernatural depravity, and felt proud of it. At the end of 2 days I was ready to go to doctoring again. I took a few more unfailing remedies, and finally drove my cold from my head to my lungs. I got to coughing incessantly, and my voice fell below zero. I conversed in a thundering bass, 2 octaves below my natural tone. I could only compass my regular nightly repose by coughing myself down to a state of utter exhaustion, and then the moment I began to talk in my sleep, my discordant voice woke me up again. My case grew more and more serious every day. Plain gin was recommended. I took it. Then gin and molasses. I took that also. Then gin and onions. I added the onions, and took all 3. I detected no particular result, however, except that I had acquired a breath like a buzzard's. I found I had to travel for my health. I went to Lake Bigler with my reportorial comrade Wilson. It is gratifying to me to reflect that we traveled in considerable style. We went in the Pioneer coach, and my friend took all his baggage with him, consisting of 2 excellent silk handkerchiefs and a daguerreotype of his grandmother. We sailed and hunted and fished and danced all day, and I doctored my cough all night. By managing in this way, I made out to improve every hour in the 24. but my disease continued to grow worse. A sheet bath was recommended. I had never refused a remedy yet, and it seemed poor policy to commence then. Therefore I determined to take a sheet bath, notwithstanding I had no idea what sort of arrangement it was. It was administered at midnight, and the weather was very frosty. My breast and back were bared, and a sheet (there appeared to be 1,000 yards of it) soaked in ice water, was wound around me until I resembled a swab for a Columbiad. It is a cruel expedient. When the chilly rag touches one's warm flesh, it makes him start with sudden violence, and gasp for breath just as men do in the death agony. It froze the marrow in my bones and stopped the beating of my heart. I thought my time had come. Young Wilson said the circumstance reminded him of an anecdote about a negro who was being baptized, and who slipped from the parson's grasp and came near being drowned. He floundered around, though, and finally rose up out of the water considerably strangled and furiously angry, and started ashore at once, spouting water like a whale, and remarking, with great asperity, that "one of dese days some gentleman's nigger gwine to get killed with just such damn foolishness as dis." Never take a sheet bath. Never. Next to meeting a lady acquaintance who, for reasons best known to herself, don't see you when she looks at you, and don't know you when she does see you, it is the most uncomfortable thing in the world. But, as I was saying, when the sheet bath failed to cure my cough, a lady friend recommended the application of a mustard plaster to my breast. I believe that would have cured me effectually if it had not been for young Wilson. When I went to bed, I put my mustard plaster, which was a very gorgeous one, 18 inches square, where I could reach it when I was ready for it. But young Wilson got hungry in the night, and here is food for imagination. After sojourning a week at Lake Bigler, I went to Steamboat Springs, and besides the steam baths, I took a lot of the vilest medicines that were ever concocted. They would have cured me, but I had to go back to Virginia City, where, notwithstanding the variety of new remedies I absorbed every day, I managed to aggravate my disease by carelessness and undue exposure. I finally concluded to visit San Francisco, and the first day I got there a lady at the hotel told me to drink a quart of whiskey every 24 hours, and a friend uptown recommended precisely the same course. Each advised me to take a quart. That made half a gallon. I did it, and still live. Now, with the kindest motives in the world, I offer for the consideration of consumptive patients the variegated course of treatment I have lately gone through. Let them try it. If it don't cure, it can't more than kill them. End of chapter 61. This is chapter 62 of Sketches New and Old. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Sketches New and Old by Mark Twain, chapter 62, A Curious Pleasure Excursion, published at the time of the Comet Scare in the summer of 1874. We have received the following advertisement, but inasmuch as it concerns a matter of deep and general interest, we feel fully justified in inserting it in our reading columns. We are confident that our conduct in this regard needs only explanation, not apology. Editor, New York Herald. Advertisement. This is to inform the public that in connection with Mr. Barnum I have leased the Comet for a term of years, and I desire also to solicit the public patronage in favor of a beneficial enterprise which we have in view. We propose to fit up comfortable and even luxurious accommodations in the Comet for as many persons as will honor us with their patronage, and make an extended excursion among the heavenly bodies. We shall prepare 1,000,000 staterooms in the tail of the Comet, with hot and cold water, gas, looking-glass, parachute, umbrella, etc., in each, and shall construct more if we meet with a sufficiently generous encouragement. We shall have billiard-rooms, card-rooms, music-rooms, bowling-alleys, and many spacious theaters and free libraries, and on the main deck we propose to have a driving park, with upward of 100,000 miles of roadway in it. We shall publish daily newspapers also. Departure of the comet. The comet will leave New York at 10 p.m. on the 20th inst., and therefore it will be desirable that the passengers be on board by 8 at the latest, to avoid confusion in getting under way. It is not known whether passports will be necessary or not, but it is deemed best that passengers provide them, and so guard against all contingencies. No dogs will be allowed on board. This rule has been made in deference to the existing state of feeling regarding these animals, and will be strictly adhered to. The safety of the passengers will in all ways be jealously looked to. A substantial iron railing will be put up all around the comet, and no one will be allowed to go to the edge and look over unless accompanied by either my partner or myself. The postal service will be of the completest character. Of course the telegraph, and the telegraph only, will be employed. Consequently, friends occupying staterooms 20 million and even 30 million miles apart will be able to send a message and receive a reply inside of 11 days. Night messages will be half rate. The whole of this vast postal system will be under the personal superintendence of Mr. Hale of Maine. Meals served at all hours. Meals served in staterooms charged extra. Hostility is not apprehended from any great planet, but we have thought it best to err on the safe side, and therefore have provided a proper number of mortars, siege guns, and boarding pikes. History shows that small, isolated communities, such as the people of remote islands, are prone to be hostile to strangers, and so the same may be the case with the inhabitants of stars of the 10th or 20th magnitude. We shall in no case wantonly offend the people of any star, but shall treat all alike with urbanity and kindliness, never conducting ourselves toward an asteroid after a fashion which we could not venture to assume toward Jupiter or Saturn. I repeat that we shall not wantonly offend any star, but at the same time we shall promptly resent any injury that may be done us, or any insolence offered us, by parties or governments residing in any star in the firmament. Although averse to the shedding of blood, we shall still hold this course rigidly and fearlessly, not only toward single stars, but toward constellations. We shall hope to leave a good impression of America behind us in every nation we visit, from Venus to Uranus. And at all events, if we cannot inspire love, we shall at least compel respect for our country wherever we go. We shall take with us, free of charge, a great force of missionaries, and shed the true light upon all the celestial orbs which, physically aglow, are yet morally in darkness. Sunday schools will be established wherever practicable. Compulsory education will also be introduced. The comet will visit Mars first, and proceed to Mercury, Jupiter, Venus, and Saturn. Parties connected with the government of the District of Columbia and with the former city government of New York, who may desire to inspect the rings, will be allowed time and every facility. Every star of prominent magnitude will be visited, and time allowed for excursions to points of interest inland. The Dog Star has been stricken from the program. Much time will be spent in the Great Bear, and indeed in every constellation of importance, so, also, with the Sun and Moon and the Milky Way, otherwise the Gulf Stream of the skies. Clothing suitable for wear in the sun should be provided. Our program has been so arranged that we shall seldom go more than 100 millions of miles at a time without stopping at some star. This will necessarily make the stoppages frequent and preserve the interest of the tourist. Baggage checked through to any point on the route. Parties desiring to make only a part of the proposed tour, and thus save expense, may stop over at any star they choose and wait for the return voyage. After visiting all the most celebrated stars and constellations in our system, and personally inspecting the remotest sparks that even the most powerful telescope can now detect in the firmament, we shall proceed with good heart upon a stupendous voyage of discovery among the countless whirling worlds that make turmoil in the mighty wastes of space, that stretch their solemn solitudes, their unimaginable vastness, billions upon billions of miles away, beyond the farthest verge of telescopic vision, till by comparison the little sparkling vault we used to gaze at on earth shall seem like a remembered phosphorescent flash of spangles which some tropical voyager's prow stirred into life for a single instant, and which 10,000 miles of phosphorescent seas and tedious lapse of time had since diminished to an incident utterly trivial in his recollection. Children occupying seats at the first table will be charged full fare. First-class fare from the earth to Uranus, including visits to the sun and moon and all the principal planets on the route, will be charged at the low rate of $2 for every 50,000,000 miles of actual travel. A great reduction will be made where parties wish to make the round trip. This comet is new and in thorough repair and is now on her first voyage. She is confessedly the fastest on the line. She makes 20,000,000 miles a day, with her present facilities, but with a picked American crew and good weather, we are confident we can get 40,000,000 out of her. Still, we shall never push her to a dangerous speed, and we shall rigidly prohibit racing with other comets. Passengers desiring to diverge at any point or return will be transferred to other comets. We make close connections at all principal points with all reliable lines. Safety can be depended upon. It is not to be denied that the heavens are infested with old ramshackle comets that have not been inspected or overhauled in 10,000 years, and which ought long ago to have been destroyed or turned into hail barges, but with these we have no connection whatever. Steerage passengers not allowed abaft the main hatch. Complimentary round-trip tickets have been tendered to General Butler, Mr. Shepard, Mr. Richardson, and other eminent gentlemen whose public services have entitled them to the rest and relaxation of a voyage of this kind. Parties desiring to make the round trip will have extra accommodation. The entire voyage will be completed and the passengers landed in New York again on the 14th of December, 1991. This is at least 40 years quicker than any other comet can do it in. Nearly all the back pay members contemplate making the round trip with us in case their constituents will allow them a holiday. Every harmless amusement will be allowed on board, but no pools permitted on the run of the comet, no gambling of any kind. All fixed stars will be respected by us, but such stars as seem to need fixing we shall fix. If it makes trouble, we shall be sorry, but firm. Mr. Coggia having leased his comet to us, she will no longer be called by his name, but by my partner's. N.B. Passengers, by paying double fare, will be entitled to a share in all the new stars, suns, moons, comets, meteors, and magazines of thunder and lightning we may discover. Patent medicine people will take notice that we carry bulletin boards and a paintbrush along for use in the constellations, and are open to terms. Cremationists are reminded that we are going straight to some hot places, and are open to terms. To other parties, our enterprise is a pleasure excursion, but individually we mean business. We shall fly our comet for all it is worth. For further particulars, or for freight or passage, apply on board, or to my partner, but not to me, since I do not take charge of the comet until she is under way. It is necessary at a time like this that my mind should not be burdened with small business details. Mark Twain. End of chapter 62. This is Chapter 63 of Sketches New and Old. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Sketches New and Old by Mark Twain, Chapter 63, Running for Governor, written about 1870. A few months ago I was nominated for governor of the great state of New York, to run against Mr. John T. Smith and Mr. J. on an independent ticket. I somehow felt that I had one prominent advantage over these gentlemen, and that was good character. It was easy to see by the newspapers that if ever they had known what it was to bear a good name, that time had gone by. It was plain that in these latter years
They had become familiar with all manner of shameful crimes. But at the very moment that I was exalting my advantage and joying in it in secret, there was a muddy undercurrent of discomfort riling the deeps of my happiness, and that was the having to hear my name bandied about in familiar connection with those of such people. I grew more and more disturbed. Finally I wrote my grandmother about it. Her answer came quick and sharp. She said, "You have never done one single thing in all your life to be ashamed of, not one. Look at the newspapers, look at them, and comprehend what sort of characters Messrs. Smith and Blank are, and then see if you are willing to lower yourself to their level and enter a public canvass with them." It was my very thought. I did not sleep a single moment that night, but after all I could not recede. I was fully committed, and must go on with the fight. As I was looking listlessly over the papers at breakfast, I came across this paragraph, and I may truly say I never was so confounded before. Perjury. Perhaps, now that Mr. Mark Twain is before the people as a candidate for governor, he will condescend to explain how he came to be convicted of perjury by 34 witnesses in Wakawak, Cochin, China, in 1863, the intent of which perjury being to rob a poor native widow and her helpless family of a meager plantain patch, their only stay and support in their bereavement and desolation. Mr. Twain owes it to himself, as well as to the great people whose suffrages he asks, to clear this matter up. Will he do it? I thought I should burst with amazement. Such a cruel, heartless charge. I never had seen Cochin China. I never had heard of Wakawak. I didn't know a plantain patch from a kangaroo. I did not know what to do. I was crazed and helpless. I let the day slip away without doing anything at all. The next morning the same paper had this, nothing more. Significant. Mr. Twain, it will be observed, is suggestively silent about the Cochin China perjury. Mem. During the rest of the campaign this paper never referred to me in any other way than as the infamous perjurer Twain. Next came the Gazette, with this: "Wanted to know, will the new candidate for governor deign to explain to certain of his fellow citizens, who are suffering to vote for him, the little circumstance of his cabin-mates in Montana losing small valuables from time to time, until at last, these things having been invariably found on Mr. Twain's person or in his trunk newspaper he rolled his traps in, they felt compelled to give him a friendly admonition for his own good, and so tarred and feathered him and rode him on a rail, and then advised him to leave a permanent vacuum in the place he usually occupied in the camp. Will he do this?" Could anything be more deliberately malicious than that? For I never was in Montana in my life. After this journal customarily spoke of me as Twain the Montana Thief. I got to picking up papers apprehensively, much as one would lift a desired blanket which he had some idea might have a rattlesnake under it. One day this met my eye: "The Lie Nailed." By the sworn affidavits of Michael O'Flanagan, Esquire, of the 5 Points, and Mr. Snub Rafferty and Mr. Catty Mulligan of Water Street, it is established that Mr. Mark Twain's vile statement that the lamented grandfather of our noble standard-bearer J. was hanged for highway robbery is a brutal and gratuitous lie, without a shadow of foundation in fact. It is disheartening to virtuous men to see such shameful means resorted to achieve political success, as the attacking of the dead in their graves, and defiling their honored names with slander. When we think of the anguish this miserable falsehood must cause the innocent relatives and friends of the deceased, we are almost driven to incite an outraged and insulted public to summary and unlawful vengeance upon the traducer. But no, let us leave him to the agony of a lacerated conscience, though if passion should get the better of the public, and in its blind fury they should do the traducer bodily injury, it is but too obvious that no jury could convict and no court punish the perpetrators of the deed.
The ingenious closing sentence had the effect of moving me out of bed with dispatch that night, and out at the back door also, while the outraged and insulted public surged in the front way, breaking furniture and windows in their righteous indignation as they came, and taking off such property as they could carry when they went. And yet I can lay my hand upon the book and say that I never slandered Mr. Blank's grandfather. More, I had never even heard of him or mentioned him up to that day and date. I will state, in passing, that the journal above quoted from always referred to me afterward as Twain the Body Snatcher. The next newspaper article that attracted my attention was the following: A sweet candidate. Mr. Mark Twain, who was to make such a blighting speech at the mass meeting of the Independents last night, didn't come to time. A telegram from his physician stated that he had been knocked down by a runaway team, and his leg broken in 2 places, sufferer lying in great agony, and so forth, and a lot more bosh of the same sort. And the Independents tried hard to swallow the wretched subterfuge, and pretend that they did not know what was the real reason of the absence of the abandoned creature whom they denominate their standard-bearer. A certain man was seen to reel into Mr. Twain's hotel last night in a state of beastly intoxication. It is the imperative duty of the Independents to prove that this besotted brute was not Mark Twain himself. We have them at last. This is a case that admits of no shirking. The voice of the people demands in thunder tones, "Who was that man?" It was incredible, absolutely incredible, for a moment, that it was really my name that was coupled with this disgraceful suspicion. 3 long years had passed over my head since I had tasted ale, beer, wine, or liquor of any kind. It shows what effect the times were having on me when I say that I saw myself confidently dubbed Mr. Delirium Tremens Twain in the next issue of that journal without a pang, notwithstanding I knew that with monotonous fidelity the paper would go on calling me so to the very end. By this time anonymous letters were getting to be an important part of my mail matter. This form was common: "How about that old woman you kiked of your premises, which was begging? Paul Pry." And this: "There is things which you have done which is unbeknowns to anybody but me. You better trot out a few dolls to yours truly, or you'll hear through the papers from Handy Andy." This is about the idea. I could continue them until the reader was surfeited, if desirable. Shortly the principal Republican journal convicted me of wholesale bribery, and the leading Democratic paper nailed an aggravated case of blackmailing to me. In this way I acquired 2 additional names: Twain the Filthy Corruptionist, and Twain the Loathsome Embracer. By this time there had grown to be such a clamor for an answer to all the dreadful charges that were laid to me that the editors and leaders of my party said it would be political ruin for me to remain silent any longer. As if to make their appeal the more imperative, the following appeared in one of the papers the very next day: "Behold the man. The independent candidate still maintains silence, because he dare not speak. Every accusation against him has been amply proved, and they have been endorsed and re-endorsed by his own eloquent silence, till at this day he stands forever convicted. Look upon your candidate, Independents. Look upon the infamous perjurer, the Montana thief, the body-snatcher. Contemplate your incarnate delirium tremens, your filthy corruptionist, your loathsome embracer. Gaze upon him, ponder him well, and then say if you can give your honest votes to a creature who has earned this dismal array of titles by his hideous crimes, and dares not open his mouth in denial of any one of them." There was no possible way of getting out of it, and so in deep humiliation I set about preparing to answer a mass of baseless charges and mean and wicked falsehoods. But I never finished the task, for the very next morning a paper came out with a new horror, a fresh malignity, and seriously charged me with burning a lunatic asylum with all its inmates, because it obstructed the view from my house. This threw me into a sort of panic, And then came the charge of poisoning my uncle to get his property, with an imperative demand that the grave should be opened. This drove me to the verge of distraction. On top of this, I was accused of employing toothless and incompetent old relatives to prepare the food for the foundling hospital when I was warden. I was wavering, and at last, as a due and fitting climax to the shameless persecution that party rancor had inflicted upon me, 9 little toddling children of all shades of color and degrees of raggedness were taught to rush onto the platform at a public meeting and clasp me around the legs and call me Pa. I gave it up. I hauled down my colors and surrendered. I was not equal to the requirements of a gubernatorial campaign in the state of New York, and so I sent in my withdrawal from the candidacy, and in bitterness of spirit signed it, "Truly yours, once a decent man, but now Mark Twain, I.P., M.T., B.S., D.T., F.C., and L.E." End of chapter 63. This is chapter 64 of Sketches New and Old. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Sketches New and Old by Mark Twain, chapter 64, A Mysterious Visit. The first notice that was taken of me when I "settled down" recently was by a gentleman who said he was an assessor, and connected with the U.S. Internal Revenue Department. I said I had never heard of his branch of business before, but I was very glad to see him all the same. Would he sit down? He sat down. I did not know anything particular to say, and yet I felt that people who have arrived at the dignity of keeping house must be conversational, must be easy and sociable in company. So, in default of anything else to say, I asked him if he was opening his shop in our neighborhood. He said he was. I did not wish to appear ignorant, but I had hoped he would mention what he had for sale. I ventured to ask him how was trade, and he said so-so. I then said we would drop in, and if we liked his house as well as any other, we would give him our custom. He said he thought we would like his establishment well enough to confine ourselves to it, said he never saw anybody who would go off and hunt up another man in his line after trading with him once. That sounded pretty complacent, but barring that natural expression of villainy which we all have, the man looked honest enough. I do not know how it came about exactly, but gradually we appeared to melt down and run together, conversationally speaking, and then everything went along as comfortably as clockwork. We talked and talked and talked, at least I did, and we laughed and laughed and laughed, at least he did. But all the time I had my presence of mind about me. I had my native shrewdness turned on full head, as the engineers say. I was determined to find out all about his business in spite of his obscure answers, and I was determined I would have it out of him without his suspecting what I was at. I meant to trap him with a deep, deep ruse. I would tell him all about my own business, and he would naturally so warm to me during this seductive burst of confidence that he would forget himself and tell me all about his affairs before he suspected what I was about. I thought to myself, "My son, you little know what an old fox you are dealing with." I said, "Now, you never would guess what I made lecturing this winter at last spring." "No, don't believe I could, to save me. Let me see. About $2,000 maybe. But no, sir, I know you couldn't have made that much. Say 1,700 maybe?" "Ah, I knew you couldn't. My lecturing receipts for last spring and this winter were $14,750. What do you think of that?" "Why, it is amazing, perfectly amazing. I will make a note of it. And you say even this wasn't all?" "All? Why, bless you, there was my income from the Daily War Whoop for 4 months. About, well, what should you say to about $8,000, for instance?" "Say? Why, I should say I should like to see myself rolling in just such another ocean of affluence. 8,000! I'll make a note of it. Why, man, and on top of all this am I to understand that you had still more income? Why, you're only in the suburbs of it, so to speak. There's my book, The Innocents Abroad, price $3.50 to $5, according to the binding. Listen to me. Look me in the eye. During the last 4 months and a half, saying nothing of sales before that, but just simply during the 4 months and a half, we've sold 95,000 copies of that book. 95,000! Think of it. Average $4 a copy, say. It's nearly $400,000, my son. I get half. The suffering Moses! I'll set that down. 14,758, 200. Total, say, well, upon my word, the grand total is about $213,000 or $14,000. Is that possible? Possible? If there's any mistake, it's the other way. $214,000 cash is my income for this year if I know how to cipher. Then the gentleman got up to go. It came over me most uncomfortably that maybe I had made my revelations for nothing, besides being flattered into stretching them considerably by the stranger's astonished exclamations. But no, at the last moment the gentleman handed me a large envelope and said it contained his advertisement, and that I would find out all about his business in it, and that he would be happy to have my custom, would, in fact, be proud to have the custom of a man of such prodigious income, and that he used to think there were several wealthy men in the city, but when they came to trade with him he discovered that they barely had enough to live on, and that, in truth, it had been such a weary, weary age since he had seen a rich man face to face, and talked to him, and touched him with his hands, that he could hardly refrain from embracing me. In fact, would esteem it a great favor if I would let him embrace me. This so pleased me that I did not try to resist, but allowed this simple-hearted stranger to throw his arms about me and weep a few tranquilizing tears down the back of my neck. Then he went away. As soon as he was gone I opened his advertisement. I studied it attentively for 4 minutes. I then called up the cook and said, "Hold me while I faint. Let Marie turn the griddle cakes." By and by, when I came to, I sent down to the rum mill on the corner and hired an artist by the week to sit up nights and curse that stranger, and give me a lift occasionally in the daytime when I came to a hard place. Ah, what a miscreant he was! His advertisement was nothing in the world but a wicked tax return, a string of impertinent questions about my private affairs, occupying the best part of 4 foolscap pages of fine print, questions, I may remark, gotten up with such marvelous ingenuity that the oldest man in the world couldn't understand what the most of them were driving at. Questions, too, that were calculated to make a man report about 4 times his actual income to keep from swearing to a falsehood. I looked for a loophole, but there did not appear to be any. Inquiry number 1 covered my case as generously and as amply as an umbrella could cover an ant-hill. What were your profits during the past year from any trade, business, or vocation, wherever carried on? And that inquiry was backed up by 13 others of an equally searching nature, the most modest of which required information as to whether I had committed any burglary or highway robbery, or, by any arson or other secret source of emolument, had acquired property which was not enumerated in my statement of income as set opposite to inquiry number 1. It was plain that that stranger had enabled me to make a goose of myself. It was very, very plain, and so I went out and hired another artist. By working on my vanity, the stranger had seduced me into declaring an income of $214,000. By law, $1,000 of this was exempt from income tax, the only relief I could see, and it was only a drop in the ocean. At the legal 5%, I must pay to the government the sum of $10,650 income tax. I may remark in this place that I did not do it. I am acquainted with a very opulent man whose house is a palace, whose table is regal, whose outlays are enormous, yet a man who has no income, as I have often noticed by the revenue returns. and to him I went for advice in my distress. He took my dreadful exhibition of receipts, he put on his glasses, he took his pen, and presto! I was a pauper. It was the neatest thing that ever was. He did it simply by deftly manipulating the bill of deductions. He set down my state, national, and municipal taxes at so much, my losses by shipwreck, fire, etc., at so much, my losses on sales of real estate, on livestock sold, on payments for rent of homestead, on repairs, improvements, interest, on previously taxed salary as an officer of the United States Army, Navy, Revenue Service, and other things. He got astonishing deductions out of each and every one of these matters, each and every one of them. And when he was done he handed me the paper, and I saw at a glance that during the year my income in the way of profits had been $1,250.40.
"Now," said he, "the $1,000 is exempt by law. What you want to do is to go and swear this document in and pay tax on the $250.
While he was making this speech, his little boy Willie lifted a $2 greenback out of his vest pocket and vanished with it, and I would wager anything that if my stranger were to call on that little boy tomorrow he would make a false return of his income. "Do you," said I, "do you always work up the deductions after this fashion in your own case, sir?"
"Well, I should say so. If it weren't for those 11 saving clauses under the head of deductions, I should be beggared every year to support this hateful and wicked, this extortionate and tyrannical government."
This gentleman stands away up among the very best of the solid men of the city, the men of moral weight, of commercial integrity, of unimpeachable social spotlessness, and so I bowed to his example. I went down to the Revenue Office, and under the accusing eyes of my old visitor I stood up and swore to lie after lie, fraud after fraud, villainy after villainy, till my soul was coated inches and inches thick with perjury, and my self-respect gone forever and ever. But what of it? It is nothing more than thousands of the richest and proudest and most respected, honored, and courted men in America do every year. And so I don't care. I am not ashamed. I shall simply, for the present, talk little and eschew fire-proof gloves, lest I fall into certain dreadful habits irrevocably. End of chapter 64. And end of Sketches New and Old by Mark Twain, read by John Greenman.